On the 8th day of June, in the year 793, a small community of monks on a tidal island off the northeast coast of England looked out across the gray waters of the North Sea and saw something they could not explain. Low shapes on the horizon, moving fast against the wind. Square sails, striped in red and white, catching the thin morning light. The shapes resolved into vessels unlike anything the monks had ever seen. Long, narrow, predatory, their curved prows cutting through the swell with the silence of approaching wolves. There were perhaps 5 of them, perhaps more. Each carried 30 or 40 men. The monks of Lindisfarne had no walls. They had no weapons. They had a stone church, a scriptorium filled with illuminated manuscripts representing decades of painstaking labor, a treasury of silver chalices and gold-covered reliquaries, and a faith so deep it had never occurred to them that God might not protect his own house. By midday, the monastery was burning. The treasury was empty. Several monks lay dead on the beach, their blood mixing with the salt foam. Others had been bound with rope and dragged to the ships. They would be sold as slaves in markets across the northern seas. The great Lindisfarne Gospels survived only because they had been hidden, or because the raiders did not recognize their value. Everything made of precious metal was gone. The manuscripts that could not be carried were scattered across the rocks, their painted pages dissolving in the rain. The scholar Alcuin of York, writing from the court of Charlemagne on the continent, received news of the attack and composed a letter that trembled with disbelief. Never before, he wrote, had such a terror appeared in Britain. The Church of St. Cuthbert, one of the holiest sites in all of Christendom, had been spattered with the blood of priests. He saw in the attack a sign of divine punishment, a horror beyond comprehension. He was wrong about the cause, but he was right about the consequence. What arrived on that June morning was not a punishment from God. It was the opening act of an age that would last nearly 3 centuries and reshape every corner of the European world, from the frozen shores of Greenland to the sun-baked walls of Constantinople. The men in those ships came from a land of deep fjords and dark winters, a land so far north that summer nights never fully darkened and winter days barely saw the sun. They had no written history, they had no unified kingdom, they had no name for themselves as a collective people, but the world would soon find a name for them. They were the Vikings, and this is their entire history. The sources for what follows are scattered across centuries and civilizations, written in 6 languages by people who were, almost without exception, the Vikings' victims or rivals. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, maintained by English monks who recorded Norse raids with the weary precision of men cataloging a recurring natural disaster. The Frankish royal annals, compiled at the court of Charlemagne and his successors, documenting the increasingly desperate efforts of continental Europe to defend itself against seaborne attack. The writings of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who encountered Swedish Vikings on the banks of the Volga River in 921 and left behind one of the most vivid first-hand accounts of Norse culture ever committed to paper. Their funeral rites, their hygiene, their terrifying physical presence. The Icelandic sagas, composed 2 or 3 centuries after the events they describe, blending historical memory with literary art in ways that scholars still debate, yet preserving names, places, and psychological truths that no other source records. The Annals of Ulster and the Annals of Saint-Bertin, Byzantine court records, runic inscriptions carved into standing stones across Scandinavia, and the archaeological record itself, the ship burials, the silver hoards, the settlement foundations that continue to emerge from northern soil. No single source tells the whole story. And together, layered carefully and read against each other, they reveal a civilization far more complex, far more creative, and far more consequential than the popular image of horned helmets and berserker rage has ever suggested. To understand what arrived at Lindisfarne, we must first understand where it came from. Scandinavia, in the centuries before the Viking Age, was not a single place. It was three broad regions, what we now call Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, separated by vast forests, mountain ranges, and a coastline so deeply indented by fjords that traveling by sea was often faster than traveling by land. The geography itself was a kind of teacher, and the lesson it taught was this: water is not a barrier. Water is a road. The fjords of western Norway are among the most dramatic landscapes in all of Europe. While walls of gray granite rise 1,000 feet or more directly from the sea, their faces striped with waterfalls that catch the wind and dissolve into mist before reaching the water below. At the head of each fjord, where a river empties into the salt water and deposits a thin apron of soil, there might be enough flat ground to support a farm. A single farm, often, and nothing more. The mountains behind were impassable for much of the year. The nearest neighbor might live 10 miles away by water, 100 miles away by land. A family living at the head of a Norwegian fjord in the 7th century occupied one of the most isolated homesteads in the inhabited world. And yet they were not primitive. The archaeological record reveals communities of surprising sophistication. Iron smelting was widespread, using bog iron extracted from the marshy lowlands. Woodworking had reached extraordinary levels of artistry. The carved animal heads that would later adorn Viking ships were the product of a decorative tradition centuries old, its interlacing patterns as intricate as anything produced in the monastic scriptoriums of Ireland or England. Textile production was advanced, with woven fabrics dyed in colors extracted from local plants and lichens. These were not cave dwellers stumbling out of the darkness. These were skilled farmers, smiths, and craftspeople living at the extreme edge of the agricultural world, wresting a living from land that offered very little and demanded everything. The social structure was organized around the hall, not a castle, not a palace, a longhouse, sometimes 100 feet or more in length. Built of timber and turf with a central hearth that burned continuously through the long winters. The smoke found its way out through a hole in the roof or simply accumulated in the rafters, blackening the wood and filling the interior with a permanent haze. Along the walls, raised platforms served as benches by day and sleeping places by night. The household, family, servants, slaves, and sometimes livestock in the coldest months lived together in this single space, their days governed by the light and the seasons. At the head of the hall sat the chieftain, not a king in any formal sense, not yet. A local strongman, a man who had earned loyalty through a combination of martial prowess, generosity, and shrewd judgment. His power was personal, not institutional. It lasted exactly as long as his ability to reward his followers and protect his community. If he failed at either task, another man would replace him, often violently. There was no standing army, no bureaucracy, no tax system, no written law. Authority rested on reputation, and reputation rested on action. The religion that governed these communities was old, oral, and unsentimental. The gods of the Norse, Odin, Thor, Freyr, Freya, Tyr, and dozens of others, were not gentle beings offering salvation. They were powerful, capricious, and mortal. Even the gods would die eventually at Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when the great wolf Fenrir would swallow the sun and the world would sink into the sea. There was no heaven in the Christian sense. The best a warrior could hope for was Valhalla, Odin's hall of the slain, where those who died in battle would feast and fight until the end of all things. The worst fate was not death but obscurity, to die in bed, unmourned and unremembered. This worldview, fatalistic, honor-obsessed, rooted in the certainty that all things end, produced a culture that valued action over contemplation, courage over caution, and fame over longevity. A man's name, spoken after his death by those who remembered his deeds, was the closest thing to immortality the Norse religion offered. The runic inscriptions on memorial stones across Scandinavia return obsessively to the same themes. He was a good man. He died bravely. He went far. Remember him. Denmark, the southernmost of the three Scandinavian regions, was different in character, flatter, warmer, more fertile, with a patchwork of islands and peninsulas that made it a natural crossroads between Scandinavia and the European continent. The Danes had more arable land, denser populations, and earlier contact with the Frankish kingdoms to the south. Power consolidated more quickly in Denmark than in Norway or Sweden. By the late 8th century, something approaching a Danish kingdom already existed, with a royal dynasty capable of organizing large-scale military operations and extracting tribute from subordinate chieftains. Sweden, the easternmost region, faced the Baltic Sea and the vast interior of what is now Russia and Finland. Swedish communities were more oriented toward trade than their Western counterparts, not because they were inherently more peaceful, but because the geography offered different opportunities. The river systems of Eastern Europe, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don, provided navigable routes deep into the continental interior, all the way to the Black Sea and the Caspian. Swedish traders and raiders would eventually follow these rivers into the heart of the Islamic world, but that story comes later. What united these three regions, despite their differences, was the sea. And what transformed the sea from a subsistence resource into a highway of conquest was a single technological innovation so elegant, so perfectly adapted to its purpose, that it deserves a moment of sustained attention. The longship. Everything the Vikings became, raiders, traders, settlers, explorers, was made possible by this vessel. Without it, they were isolated farmers on the northern fringe of Europe. With it, they could reach any coast in the known world. The longship's genius was not its size. It was modest by the standards of later medieval vessels, typically 60 to 80 feet long, 15 feet at the beam. Its genius was the combination of qualities that no other shipbuilding tradition had managed to unite in a single hull. It was light. Constructed using the clinker method, overlapping planks of oak, each one split rather than sawn to preserve the natural grain of the wood, riveted together with iron nails and sealed with tarred animal hair. A longship weighed perhaps 2 tons. Light enough to be carried overland by its crew when a river became impassable, or when a portage between waterways was required. Light enough to be dragged up a beach in minutes, converting a seaborne raiding force into a land army with no need for a harbor. It was shallow drafted, fully loaded with 30 or 40 men, their weapons, supplies, and plunder. A longship drew perhaps 18 inches of water. This meant it could navigate not only the open ocean, but also rivers, estuaries, and coastal shallows that deeper-keeled vessels could not enter. It could appear anywhere there was water. And in early medieval Europe, water was everywhere. Rivers penetrated deep inland. Estuaries reached the walls of major cities. A shallow-drafted warship could materialize at the heart of a kingdom that believed itself safely distant from the sea. It was fast. Under sail and favorable winds, a longship could sustain 8 to 10 knots with bursts of higher speed. Under oars with a full crew pulling in rhythm, it could maintain 5 or 6 knots for extended periods. This was not merely fast for its era. It was fast enough to outrun any pursuit, to cross the North Sea in 2 or 3 days, and to appear on a coastline with effectively no warning. It was seaworthy. The clinker construction gave the hull a degree of flexibility that a rigid structure could not match. In heavy seas, the planks worked against each other, absorbing the energy of the waves rather than fighting them. A longship did not crash through waves. It moved with them, flexing and rolling in a way that later, more rigid vessels could not replicate. Crews who sailed them described the sensation of the hull breathing beneath them in rough water. And it was beautiful. The prow, rising in a graceful curve to a carved figurehead, a dragon, a serpent, a stylized beast with gaping jaws, was designed to intimidate, but it was also a work of art. The proportions of the hull, the sweeping sheer line from bow to stern, the symmetry that allowed the ship to reverse direction without turning, these were the products of a shipbuilding tradition that had been refined over generations and that treated the vessel not merely as a tool, but as an extension of its owner's identity and honor. The archaeological evidence confirms what the written sources suggest. The Gokstad ship, excavated from a burial mound in Norway in 1880 and dated to approximately 890, is perhaps the finest surviving example. 76 feet long, 17 feet wide, built of 16 strakes of oak on each side, it was seaworthy enough that a replica sailed across the Atlantic in 1893, even completing the crossing in 28 days. The Oseberg ship, found nearby and dated to approximately 820, was more ornately decorated. Its prow carved with an intricate serpentine design of such complexity that modern woodworkers struggle to replicate it. These ships were not mass-produced. Each one was built by hand by master craftsmen whose skills were passed from father to son. The construction of a single longship represented an enormous investment of labor, material, and expertise, and possession of such a vessel conferred immediate social status. A man with a ship was a man who could go raiding, who could trade, who could transport his household to a new land if the old one grew too crowded or too poor. A man with a ship was a man with options, and in the Norse world, options were everything. By the mid-8th century, this technology had reached its mature form. The ships were ready. The men who would sail them were ready. All that remained was the question of where to go and why. The causes of the Viking Age have been debated for more than a century, and no single explanation is sufficient. But several forces converged in the late 700s to push Scandinavian men, and it was overwhelmingly men, at least in the early raiding period, out of their fjords and onto foreign shores. The first was demographic pressure. Scandinavia's arable land was limited, and the inheritance customs of Norse society concentrated that land in the hands of eldest sons. Younger sons, surplus sons, men without land, and without prospects faced a choice. They could accept subordination and poverty at home, or they could seek wealth elsewhere. The sea was right there, and the ships were ready. The calculation was straightforward. The second was opportunity. The monasteries and trading settlements of Britain, Ireland, and Francia were astonishingly wealthy by Scandinavian standards, and astonishingly undefended. The great monastic centers of Lindisfarne, Iona, Jarrow, and dozens of others sat on exposed coastlines or tidal islands, their treasuries filled with gold, silver, and precious gems donated by generations of pious kings and nobles. They had no walls. They had no garrisons. Their inhabitants were unarmed men of God who had chosen lives of prayer and scholarship. To a Norse raider arriving by sea, they were the softest targets imaginable. The political fragmentation of the British Isles and the European continent made organized resistance nearly impossible. Or England was divided into multiple competing kingdoms in Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, and others, none strong enough to control its full coastline and none inclined to cooperate with its rivals. Ireland was even more fragmented, a patchwork of dozens of petty kingdoms locked in endemic warfare. Francia, the great Carolingian empire of Charlemagne, was vast but increasingly difficult to govern, its long coastlines and navigable rivers offering countless points of vulnerability. There was no coast guard, there was no navy, there was no early warning system. A fleet of longships could cross the North Sea, raid a monastery, and be gone before any armed response could be organized. The third factor was knowledge. Scandinavian traders had been visiting the markets of Western Europe for decades before the first raids. They knew where the wealth was. They knew where the defenses were weak. They knew the tides, the river mouths, the seasonal patterns of wind and weather. The transition from peaceful trade to violent extraction was not a sudden leap. It was a gradual escalation, driven by the recognition that taking was faster and more profitable than trading. And the fourth factor was cultural. The Norse world honored the man who went out and came back with wealth, regardless of how he acquired it. Raiding was not shameful, it was glorious. A young man who joined a raiding expedition and returned with silver and stories had proven his courage, enriched his family, and earned the kind of reputation that attracted followers and marriage offers. The sagas, composed centuries later but reflecting values much older, are filled with men whose fame rests on their willingness to sail into the unknown and take what they found there. The culture did not merely permit raiding, it celebrated it. These forces, demographic, economic, strategic, and cultural, did not create the Viking Age individually. They created it together, in a convergence that was neither planned nor coordinated, but that produced across a span of perhaps 2 decades in the late 8th century, a cascade of seaborne attacks that stunned the Christian world. Lindisfarne, in 793, was the attack that entered the historical record most dramatically because it struck one of the holiest sites in English Christianity and because Alcuin's anguished letters preserved the shock for posterity. But it was not the first raid, and it was not the last. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that a few years before Lindisfarne, in 789, 3 ships appeared off the coast of Dorset in southern England. A local official, a royal reeve named Beduhard, rode down to the shore to investigate, assuming the newcomers were merchants. The men from the ships killed him. It was a small incident, barely noted at the time, but it was the first recorded contact between Norse raiders and English authority, and the reeve's fatal assumption that strangers arriving by sea must be traitors reveals just how completely unprepared the English world was for what was coming. In 794, the year after Lindisfarne, raiders struck the monastery at Jarrow further south along the Northumbrian coast. This time, the English fought back. A storm wrecked several of the attacking ships, and the survivors were captured and killed. But the raids continued. In 795, Iona, the sacred island off the western coast of Scotland where St. Columba had founded his monastery more than 2 centuries earlier, was attacked. The monks were killed or scattered. The treasures were taken. Iona would be raided again in 802 and again in 806, when 68 members of the community were massacred on the beach in a single assault. Ireland was hit in the same period. The annals of Ulster record attacks on the island of Rathlin in 795, on the monastery of St. Patrick in 798, and on a succession of coastal and island monasteries in the years that followed. The pattern was consistent. The targets were religious houses, not because the raiders had any particular hostility toward Christianity, but because religious houses were where the wealth was concentrated and the defenses were absent. These early raids were small-scale, opportunistic, and seasonal. They were not invasions. They were smash-and-grab operations conducted by independent groups of men, sometimes as few as 3 or 4 ships, who sailed out in late spring, raided through the summer months when the seas were navigable, and returned home before winter. There was no central command. There was no grand strategy. There were simply hundreds of small fjord communities, each producing a surplus of young men with ships and ambition, and nowhere to direct them except outward. The scale, however, was escalating. Each successful raiding season demonstrated that the rewards were real and the risks were manageable. Each ship that returned loaded with silver and slaves attracted more men to the enterprise the following year. The raiding economy fed on itself, growing with compound interest. By the 830s, the character of Norse activity in the British Isles and on the continent was beginning to change. The raids were becoming larger, more organized, and more sustained. Instead of single ships or small squadrons appearing for a few days and then vanishing, fleets of dozens or even hundreds of vessels were arriving and staying for entire seasons, establishing fortified camps from which they could launch repeated attacks on the surrounding countryside. In Ireland, the transformation was stark. In 841, a Norse fleet sailed up the river Liffey and established a fortified long fort, a ship camp, on its southern bank. The site would grow, over the following decades, into the town of Dublin, the first true urban settlement in Irish history. Similar long forts appeared at Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. The raiders were becoming settlers, not out of any peaceful intention, but because permanent bases allowed more efficient and sustained extraction of wealth from the surrounding territory. On the continent, The pattern was the same, but even more dramatic. In 845, a fleet of 120 ships carrying an estimated 5,000 warriors sailed up the River Seine and attacked Paris. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, was unable to mount an effective defense. He paid the raiders 7,000 pounds of silver to go away, the first major payment of what would become known as Danegeld, tribute money paid to Norse armies to buy temporary peace. The payment did exactly what any rational person would have predicted. It demonstrated that attacking Francia was profitable even without fighting, and it attracted more raiders the following year. The Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, the Garonne, every major river system in Francia became a highway for Norse penetration. Monasteries, towns, and royal estates that sat 50 or 100 miles inland, far from any coastline, found themselves under attack from men who had rowed their shallow, drafted ships upriver with the ease of a knife sliding into soft wood. The Frankish chronicles of the mid-9th century read like a catalogue of catastrophe. Nantes sacked, Tours burned, Rouen occupied, Bordeaux taken, the great abbey of Saint-Denis, burial place of French kings, looted and desecrated. The speed was the most terrifying element. A Norse fleet could appear at a river mouth, row upstream to a target, attack, and be gone before any army could march to the defense. The military technology of the Carolingian world, heavy cavalry, fortified strongholds, feudal levies that took weeks to assemble, was designed for land warfare against opponents who approached slowly and predictably. Against an enemy who arrived by water, struck without warning, and vanished before pursuit was possible, the entire defensive architecture of Western Christendom was effectively useless. And yet the story of the Viking Age, even in these early decades, was never simply a story of destruction. The same ships that carried raiders also carried traders. The same men who burned monasteries in Ireland also established the trade networks that connected Scandinavia to the markets of the wider world. The same harbors that sheltered raiding fleets became over time the nuclei of permanent settlements, and those settlements became towns, and those towns became the foundations of an economic system that would reshape Northern Europe. The distinction between raiding and trading in the Norse world was not the hard line that modern categories suggest. A man might trade peaceably at one port and raid violently at another, on the same voyage, depending on the local balance of power and opportunity. The same silver arm ring might serve as currency in a market and as plunder from a church. The same ship carried furs and amber south to Frankish markets and carried stolen chalices and enslaved monks north to Scandinavian halls. Violence and commerce were not opposites in the Viking world. They were two instruments in the same toolkit, deployed according to circumstance. This duality, creator and destroyer, trader and raider, settler and plunderer, is the central paradox of the Viking Age, and it will run through every chapter of the story that follows. The men who terrorized Christendom also built its most resilient trade networks. The men who destroyed monasteries also founded cities. The men who enslaved thousands also produced a legal and literary culture of remarkable sophistication. To tell the story of the Vikings honestly is to hold these contradictions in the mind simultaneously. We're resisting the temptation to resolve them into a simple narrative of barbarism or a simple narrative of heroism. The monks of Lindisfarne, watching their world burn on that June morning in 793, could not have known any of this. They knew only that the sea had delivered something terrible, something without precedent, something that shattered the assumption of safety that had governed their lives and the lives of their predecessors for generations. The wolves had come from the water, and nothing on the Holy Island could stop them. But the wolves had come from somewhere. They had families, farms, gods, laws, and a way of understanding the world that made their actions not merely comprehensible, but logical. To understand the centuries of upheaval that followed Lindisfarne, the conquests, the kingdoms, the voyages to the edge of the known world and beyond, we must follow the longships back to the fjords where they were built, and trace the paths they carved across an unsuspecting world. The first of those paths leads west across the gray expanse of the North Sea, to the fractured kingdoms of the British Isles. And the man waiting there, the man who would become the first to unite an English kingdom capable of resisting the Norse onslaught, was not yet born on the day Lindisfarne burned. His name was Alfred. He would earn a title that no English king before or since has been given, but that reckoning was still decades away. For now the longships had the sea to themselves, and the coasts of Europe lay open before them like an unguarded treasury stretching from horizon to horizon. The decades that followed Lindisfarne belonged to the raiders. Through the early 9th century, the attacks on the British Isles intensified with a grinding, seasonal rhythm that the monastic chroniclers recorded with increasingly terse despair. Each spring, when the North Sea calmed and the winds shifted, the longships appeared. Each autumn, when the storms returned, they withdrew. Laden with silver, livestock, and human cargo, the monks stopped writing about shock. They wrote instead about frequency, about losses, about the slow erosion of everything they had built. England, in these years, was not a country. It was a collection of rival kingdoms whose borders shifted with every generation, whose kings spent as much energy fighting each other as they did confronting any external threat. Northumbria, the great northern kingdom that had produced Lindisfarne and the Venerable Bede and some of the finest scholarship in Christendom, was tearing itself apart through dynastic civil war. Mercia, the dominant power of the English Midlands, was strong but overstretched, its attention directed southward toward Wessex and eastward toward East Anglia. East Anglia itself was wealthy but militarily weak, a flat, fertile kingdom of farmers and traders with no natural defenses and no tradition of large-scale warfare. And Wessex, the southernmost of the major kingdoms, was still a secondary power, overshadowed by Mercia and preoccupied with its own internal politics. Into this fractured landscape, the Norse descended with the precision of men who understood exactly what they were looking at. They did not attack the strongest kingdom. They attacked the gaps between kingdoms, the coastlines that no single ruler controlled, the river systems that penetrated deep into the interior where no garrison waited. But the transformation from seasonal raiding to outright invasion, or from taking wealth to taking land, did not happen overnight. It required a shift in ambition, in organization, and in scale that took several decades to mature. The catalyst, when it came, arrived in the form of something the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls the Great Heathen Army. In the autumn of 865, a Norse force unlike anything previously seen in England landed on the coast of East Anglia. The chroniclers do not give precise numbers, and modern estimates vary widely. But the force likely numbered somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 warriors, enormous by the standards of early medieval warfare, where a royal army of 500 men was considered formidable. More importantly, this was not a raiding party. The men who landed in East Anglia brought horses, which they requisitioned from the terrified local population. They brought supplies for an extended campaign. They brought their families. They had not come to raid and return. They had come to conquer and stay. The leaders of this army were, according to later saga tradition, the sons of a legendary Norse warrior named Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba. Whether Ragnar himself was a historical figure or a composite of several real men remains debated. What is beyond dispute is that his purported sons led a military campaign of devastating effectiveness that, over the next decade, dismantled the political map of England. Their method was systematic. They did not attack in the raiding season and retreat in winter. They established fortified winter camps, seized local provisions, and launched campaigns year-round. They exploited the rivalries between English kingdoms with surgical intelligence, allying temporarily with one king to destroy another, then turning on their former ally once his usefulness was exhausted. East Anglia fell first. The Great Army spent the winter of 865 to 866 there, extracting horses, food, and a forced peace from the East Anglian king Edmund. Then they turned north. In November of 866, they captured the city of York, in the ancient Roman capital of Iberacum, and the seat of Northumbrian power. The Northumbrians, in the middle of yet another civil war between rival claimants to the throne, attempted a counterattack in March of 867. They were crushed. Both Northumbrian kings died in the fighting. Northumbria, as an independent English kingdom, effectively ceased to exist. Mercia was next. The Great Army moved south in 867 and established a winter camp at Nottingham, deep in Mercian territory. The Mercian king Burgred appealed to Wessex for help, and a combined Mercian West Saxon force marched to confront the Norse. But no decisive battle was fought. Burgred negotiated a temporary peace, purchased almost certainly with silver, and the Great Army withdrew to York. It was a reprieve, not a victory. In 869, the army returned to East Anglia, and this time there was no negotiation. King Edmund, who had provided them with horses and provisions 4 years earlier, was killed. Later tradition held that he was captured in battle, refused to renounce his Christian faith, and was tied to a tree, shot with arrows until his body resembled a hedgehog, and then beheaded. The details may be hagiographic embellishment. Edmund was later venerated as a saint and martyr, but the outcome is historically certain. East Anglia was conquered. His royal dynasty was extinguished. Norse warlords divided the land among themselves. By 870, 2 of England's 4 major kingdoms had been destroyed, and a third had been humiliated into paying tribute. Only Wessex remained unconquered, and Wessex in that year was ruled by a king named Ethelred, whose younger brother had been fighting alongside him in every engagement against the Norse since the Great Army's arrival. That younger brother was Alfred. Alfred was born in 849, the 5th and youngest son of King Ethelbert of Wessex, so far removed from the throne that no one would have predicted his ascent to it. The sources for his early life come primarily from a biography written by Asser, a Welsh monk who joined Alfred's court in the 880s, and composed a life of King Alfred that is equal parts biography, hagiography, and political propaganda. Asser must be read carefully. He was writing for a patron, and his portrait of Alfred as a saintly, scholarly, divinely favored king owes as much to literary convention as to observed truth. But beneath the pious veneer, a recognizable human being emerges. As a child, Alfred was sent twice to Rome, an extraordinary journey for a boy in the 9th century, crossing the Channel, traversing Francia, and passing through the Alpine passes into Italy. Whether these journeys were diplomatic missions or pilgrimages or both, they exposed the young prince to a world far larger and more sophisticated than anything Wessex could offer. He saw cities, he saw libraries, he saw the institutional machinery of the papacy and the Carolingian court, systems of governance that operated through written law, organized bureaucracy, and centralized authority. These impressions would shape everything he later built. But Alfred's defining characteristic, the one Asser returns to repeatedly, was his love of learning in a culture that did not particularly value it. He memorized Saxon poetry as a child, reportedly winning a book of verse from his mother by being the first of her sons to learn its contents by heart. He lamented throughout his life that he had not received a proper education in his youth, that the demands of a kingdom perpetually at war had stolen the time he might have spent with books. This was not a warrior king in the mold of his ancestors. This was a man who believed that knowledge and literacy were as essential to the survival of a kingdom as swords and shields. It was an unusual conviction for his time and place. It would prove to be his most consequential one. By the time the great heathen army began its systematic destruction of English kingdoms, Alfred was a young man in his late teens, fighting in every major engagement alongside his brother Ethelred. The year 871, year which the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls the year of 9 general engagements, saw Alfred and Ethelred locked in a brutal running battle with a Norse army that had turned its full attention to Wessex. The battles raged across the Berkshire Downs, through the valleys of the Thames and the Cnut, in a series of engagements that produced no decisive victory for either side but bled both armies white. At the Battle of Ashdown in January of 871, Alfred displayed the quality that would define his military career, not brilliance, but determination. Acer records that Ethelred, characteristically devout, refused to leave his tent and join the battle until he had finished hearing Mass. Alfred, seeing the Norse forces advancing and the West Saxon line beginning to waver, took command and led the charge himself, fighting uphill against the enemy position with a ferocity that caught the Norse off guard. The West Saxons won the field. It was a rare victory in a year of mostly defeats. Ethelred died in April of 871, probably from wounds sustained in the fighting, and Alfred became king of Wessex. He was 22 years old. His kingdom was exhausted, his treasury depleted, his army diminished. The great army was still in the field. Alfred did what pragmatism demanded. He paid the Norse to leave Wessex. It was not heroic. It was survival. For the next 5 years, Alfred bought time. The great army, its attention divided between consolidating its conquests in Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, did not press its advantage against Wessex immediately. Halfdan took a portion of the army north to settle in Northumbria, in dividing the land among his followers in what amounted to a permanent Norse colonization. Another leader, Guthrum, took the remainder and focused his ambitions on the last unconquered English kingdom. The crisis came in January of 878. Guthrum attacked Wessex in midwinter, a season when no one expected military operations, when the West Saxon Fyrd, the militia of free men obligated to serve their king in wartime, had been disbanded and sent home to their farms. The attack was devastating in its unexpectedness. Guthrum's army swept through Wessex, capturing the royal estate at Chippenham and establishing it as a base of operations. Alfred's kingdom collapsed around him. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the disaster in a single devastating sentence. The great part of the people they reduced, except the King Alfred, and he with a little band made his way by wood and swamp, and after Easter he made a fort at Athelney, a small marshy island in the Somerset Levels, surrounded by reed beds and shallow water accessible only to those who knew the hidden paths through the wetlands. This was where the King of Wessex, where in the last surviving English kingdom, took refuge with a handful of loyal followers. This was the lowest point. The man who would earn the title, the Great, was hiding in a swamp. His kingdom overrun, his people scattered, his cause apparently lost. It is from this period that the famous legend of the burned cakes emerges. Alfred, sheltering anonymously in a peasant woman's cottage, was asked to watch the cakes baking by the fire and allowed them to burn, so preoccupied was he with his thoughts. The woman scolded him without knowing she was berating her king. The story is almost certainly apocryphal, first appearing in sources written long after Alfred's death, but it has survived for over 1,000 years because it captures something psychologically true. This was a man at the absolute bottom, stripped of everything: power, dignity, security, forced to endure the small humiliations of helplessness while the fate of an entire civilization hung in the balance. Alfred spent approximately 3 months at Athelney. What he did during those months is poorly documented but can be inferred from what happened next. He sent messengers. He gathered intelligence. He contacted the ealdormen, the regional lords, of the shires that had not yet submitted to Guthrum. He planned. In May of 878, Alfred emerged from the marshes and summoned the Fyrd of 3 shires, Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. The men came. That they came at all after months of Norse occupation and with every reason to believe the cause was lost, speaks to something in Alfred's character that inspired loyalty even in extremity. He met them at a place called Egbert Stone, on the eastern edge of Selwood Forest, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the people were glad to see him. From Egbert Stone, Alfred marched his reassembled army northeast to confront Guthrum's forces. The 2 armies met at Eddington on the edge of Salisbury Plain, in a battle that would determine whether an independent English kingdom survived or whether the whole of England passed under Norse control. The details of the battle itself are sparse. Acer records that Alfred fought fiercely against the entire Viking army in a dense, shield-locked formation, and that by divine will, he eventually won the victory. The Norse were driven from the field and pursued to their fortified camp at Chippenham, where Alfred besieged them for 14 days until hunger forced Guthrum to negotiate. The terms of the peace that followed were remarkable. Guthrum agreed to leave Wessex. More significantly, he agreed to accept baptism as a Christian, with Alfred himself standing as his godfather. 3 weeks after the battle, Guthrum and 30 of his leading warriors were baptized at Aller, near Athelney, the very swamp where Alfred had hidden in his darkest hour. The symbolism cannot have been lost on anyone present. The Treaty of Wedmore, and the more detailed Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum that followed established a formal boundary between Alfred's Wessex and the Norse-controlled territories to the north and east. The territory under Norse law became known as the Danelaw, a vast swath of England stretching from London to the Scottish border, where Danish customs, Danish legal practices, and Danish landholders dominated. The Danelaw was not a single kingdom, but a patchwork of Norse-controlled territories, some governed by former members of the Great Army who had settled on confiscated English land, others ruled by independent Norse warlords who owed no allegiance to anyone. Alfred had not defeated the Norse. He had survived them. He had preserved Wessex as an independent kingdom and established a boundary that, while it conceded more than half of England to Norse control, gave him the space and time he needed to build something new. And build he did. The Alfred who emerged from the crisis of 878 was not the same man who had entered it. The experience of losing everything and recovering it had crystallized a vision of kingship that went far beyond military survival. Alfred understood, with a clarity that none of his predecessors had possessed, that Wessex could not simply endure the Norse threat. It had to transform itself into something the Norse could not easily destroy. The transformation began with defense. Alfred created a system of fortified towns, burhs positioned at strategic intervals across Wessex so that no point in the kingdom was more than 20 miles from a garrisoned strong point. Each burh had permanent defenses, walls, and ditches, gates, and a designated garrison drawn from the surrounding population. The Burgel Heidage, a document listing these fortifications and the number of men assigned to defend them, survives and reveals a system of remarkable sophistication. 33 burhs connected by roads and waterways, forming an integrated defensive network that could respond to Norse incursions faster than any previous English military system. He reorganized the fjord itself, dividing it into 2 halves that served in rotation so that one half was always available for military service, while the other tended the farms that fed the kingdom. This solved the problem that had plagued every English king before him, the impossibility of keeping a peasant army in the field during planting and harvest seasons without starving the civilian population. He built a navy, not the first English fleet. Earlier kings had maintained warships, but the first fleet designed specifically to intercept Norse raiders before they could land. Asser records that Alfred designed the ships himself, making them larger and faster than Norse longships. Whether this claim is literally true or represents Asser's habitual inflation of his patron's achievements, the strategic logic was sound. If you could not prevent the Norse from crossing the sea, you could at least contest their control of the coastal waters. But Alfred's most revolutionary project was not military. It was educational. He gathered scholars from across the Christian world, Asser from Wales, Grimbald from Francia, John from Saxony, and set them to work translating the essential texts of Latin learning into the English language. He personally participated in translating several works, including Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy and Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care. He sent copies of the Pastoral Care to every bishop in his kingdom, accompanied by a preface written in his own voice that lamented the decay of learning in England and called for its restoration. The preface to the Pastoral Care is one of the most extraordinary documents of the early Middle Ages. In it, Alfred recalls a time when men came from abroad to seek wisdom in England, and now he writes, if we wish to obtain wisdom, we would have to seek it abroad. He describes churches still standing but stripped of their books, priests who could not read the Latin of their own services, and then he announces his remedy, a program of universal education, at least for freeborn men with the means to pursue it, conducted in the English language rather than in Latin. This was not mere cultural ambition. It was strategic. Alfred understood that a kingdom held together only by military force would fragment the moment that force weakened. A kingdom held together by shared language, shared law, shared literacy, and shared identity could endure blows that would shatter a purely martial state. He was building not just a defense against the Norse, but a civilization capable of absorbing, outlasting, and eventually incorporating them. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle itself, though it existed in some form before Alfred, was systematically compiled and distributed during his reign, creating a shared historical narrative for the English people. The very concept of the English as a single people, rather than Mercians and West Saxons and Northumbrians, owes much to Alfred's deliberate cultivation of a common identity rooted in language, law, and faith. Alfred died in 899 at approximately 50 years of age. He had been in poor health for much of his adult life. Asser describes chronic, painful illness that may have been Crohn's disease or some similar condition, causing him suffering so severe that he sometimes could not stand during court proceedings. He ruled for 28 years through constant warfare, chronic pain, and the exhausting labor of rebuilding a kingdom from near total destruction. He left behind a Wessex that was unrecognizable from the beleaguered kingdom he had inherited. Fortified, literate, administratively sophisticated, and militarily capable of confronting Norse armies on equal terms. He left behind a son, Edward, and a daughter, Ethelfled, who would continue the work he had begun, pushing the boundaries of Wessex northward into the Danelaw, conquering Norse-held territories one burr at a time, and slowly, over the next 50 years, constructing the thing that Alfred had imagined but never lived to see, a unified kingdom of England. But the story of the Norse in the British Isles cannot be told through English eyes alone. While Alfred was building his burhs and translating his books, the Vikings were building something equally remarkable on the other side of the Irish Sea. Ireland before the Norse arrived was a world of extraordinary cultural richness and political complexity. Dozens of petty kingdoms bound together by intricate networks of alliance, tribute, and kinship competed for dominance in a landscape without cities, without centralized government, and without any defensive infrastructure designed to repel seaborne invasion. The great monasteries, Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, Armagh, Kells, were centers of learning and art that rivaled anything in Europe. The Book of Kells, produced around the year 800, represents a pinnacle of medieval artistic achievement. But the monasteries were also centers of wealth, and wealth, in a world of Norse longships, was a beacon. The Norse raids on Ireland followed the same pattern as those on England. Small-scale coastal attacks in the 790s and 800s, escalating through the 830s into large-scale operations that penetrated deep inland via the country's river systems. But in Ireland, the Norse encountered something they had not faced in England. They encountered a warrior culture as fierce and as honor-driven as their own. The Irish kings fought back, not effectively, not in a coordinated fashion, but with a ferocity that made Ireland a more dangerous theater of operations than England. The annals of Ulster record Norse defeats as well as victories, ambushes that caught raiding parties on the march, and naval engagements where Irish forces contested Norse control of rivers and coastal waters. The Norse never conquered Ireland in the way they conquered Northumbria and East Anglia. They carved out coastal enclaves, Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, Limerick, and from these fortified bases they traded, raided, and intermarried with the Irish population in a pattern of violent coexistence that persisted for 2 centuries. Dublin, founded as a long fort in 841, even became the jewel of the Norse-Irish world. Within a generation, it had grown from a fortified camp into a thriving trading town, its harbor crowded with ships carrying goods between Scandinavia, England, Francia, and the wider world. Dublin's slave market was among the busiest in Northern Europe. A grim commerce that funneled captured Irish, English, and Scottish men, women, and children into the broader Norse trading network, where they might end up as household servants in Iceland, as laborers in Scandinavia, or as commodities sold to Arab merchants on the Volga. The Norse towns in Ireland were something genuinely new. Ireland had never had urban settlements before the Norse arrived. The long forts, originally built for military purposes, evolved into permanent communities with workshops, warehouses, market squares, and defensive walls. Excavations in Dublin's Wood Quay area, conducted in the 1970s and 1980s, revealed layer upon layer of Norse occupation. Timber buildings, leather shoes, bone combs, gaming pieces, silver coins, and the detritus of daily life preserved in the waterlogged soil. The Norse did not merely raid Ireland, they gave it its first cities. But those cities existed in a state of perpetual tension with the Irish kingdoms that surrounded them. Dublin changed hands repeatedly, sometimes ruled by Norse kings, sometimes seized by Irish ones, sometimes governed by hybrid Norse-Irish dynasties whose members bore names from both cultures and practiced customs drawn from both traditions. The boundary between Norse and Irish blurred over generations. Norse settlers adopted the Irish language. Irish kings employed Norse mercenaries. Marriages across the cultural divide produced children who belonged fully to neither world and partially to both. This was the pattern that repeated itself wherever the Norse settled in significant numbers. They did not remain forever separate. They adapted. They intermarried. They absorbed local customs while transmitting their own. The result was not assimilation in one direction, but a genuine cultural fusion that produced something new. Communities that were neither purely Norse nor purely native, but something in between, bearing the marks of both traditions in their language, their art, their law, and their DNA. The same process was unfolding in the Danelaw in England, where Danish settlers were adopting English agricultural practices, while English communities adopted Danish legal terminology. In hundreds of place names across northern and eastern England preserve the memory of this settlement. Every village ending in by from the Old Norse for farmstead, every town ending in thorp from the Norse for secondary settlement. Derby, Whitby, Grimsby, Scunthorpe, Cleethorpes, the map of England is written partly in Danish. And while the Western Vikings, Hrundaur, predominantly Norwegian and Danish, were reshaping the British Isles and the Frankish kingdoms, their Swedish cousins were carving an entirely different path through the east, down the rivers of what is now Russia, into a world that the monks of Lindisfarne could never have imagined. That Eastern story and the extraordinary civilization it produced requires its own telling, but it begins, like all Viking stories, with men in ships following water wherever it led them, through forests so vast that a man could walk for weeks without seeing the sun, past settlements of Slavic and Finnic peoples who had never encountered Scandinavians before, and eventually to the glittering walls of the richest city in the world. Constantinople was waiting, and the Northmen were coming. The rivers of Eastern Europe flow like veins through a body of impossible scale. The Volga, the longest river in Europe, runs more than 2,000 miles from the forested uplands northwest of Moscow to the Caspian Sea. The Dnieper cuts south through what is now Ukraine to the Black Sea. The Don, the Dvina, the Neva, each one a corridor through landscapes of birch forest, steppe grassland, and marshland so vast that the horizon dissolved into a featureless blur of green and gray that could swallow entire armies without trace. The Scandinavians who penetrated this world were predominantly Swedish, though the distinction between Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish was more fluid in the 9th century than modern national boundaries suggest. They came from the Baltic coast, from the trading settlements of Birka and Gotland, and they came not primarily as raiders, but as traders, though the distinction, as always in the Norse world, was negotiable. The Slavic and Finnic peoples who encountered them called them the Rus, a name whose precise origins scholars still debate. Some derive it from the Old Norse word for men who row. Others connect it to Roslagen, the coastal region of Sweden from which many of these traders departed. Whatever its etymology, the name stuck. The Rus gave their name to the land they traversed, and that land is still called Russia. The eastern route had been developing quietly for decades before the raids on Lindisfarne. Scandinavian traders had been crossing the Baltic and navigating the river systems of the eastern interior since at least the mid-8th century, following routes that connected the fur-rich forests of the north to the luxury markets of the south. The commodity that drove this trade was, above all, fur: sable, marten, fox, beaver, squirrel. The forests of the north produced pelts in quantities that the southern markets devoured with insatiable appetite. Furs were the oil of the early medieval world, a commodity so universally valued that they functioned as currency in regions where coined money had not yet penetrated. Oh, but furs were only the beginning. The eastern trade routes also carried slaves, honey, wax, amber, and walrus ivory southward, and returned northward with silver, silk, spices, glass, and the products of civilizations far older and more sophisticated than anything in Scandinavia. Arab silver dirhams, minted in the mints of Baghdad, Samarkand, and Bukhara, flowed northward through the river networks in astonishing quantities. Tens of thousands of these coins have been found in Scandinavian hoards. On Gotland alone, more than 700 separate coin hoards containing Arabic silver have been excavated. The sheer volume of this coinage speaks to a trade network of extraordinary scale and profitability, connecting the birch forests of the Baltic to the bazaars of the Abbasid Caliphate through a chain of river portages, of fortified trading posts and diplomatic relationships maintained across thousands of miles. The Rus did not simply trade through the eastern interior. They settled it, establishing fortified bases at key points along the river systems, places where portages connected one river to another, where tributaries converged, where the geography created natural choke points that could be controlled and taxed. These bases grew into the first proto-urban settlements of the Eastern Slavic world. Novgorod on the Volkhov River near Lake Ilmen became the northern anchor of the Rus trading network. Staraya Ladoga, closer to the Baltic coast, served as the initial point of entry. Kiev, far to the south on the Dnieper, became the most important of all, a hilltop fortress commanding the river route to the Black Sea, and beyond it, to Constantinople. Now, the relationship between the Rus and the Slavic populations they encountered was complex, layered, and does not reduce neatly to a narrative of conquest or cooperation. The Rus were a minority, a thin Scandinavian elite operating among a vastly larger Slavic and Finnic population. They maintained their dominance through military skill, commercial acumen, and the same talent for adaptive rule that the Norse displayed in Ireland and the Danelaw. They intermarried with local women. They adopted Slavic customs where it suited them. They imposed their own legal and military practices where they could. Within a few generations, the distinction between Rus and Slav was blurring at the edges, though the ruling dynasties maintained Scandinavian names and Norse cultural practices longer than the general population. The earliest written account of this Eastern Rus world comes from an unlikely source. In 921, the Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtadir sent a diplomatic mission from Baghdad to the king of the Volga Bulgars, a Turkic people who had recently converted to Islam and who controlled a crucial stretch of the Volga trade route. The mission secretary was a man named Ahmad ibn Fadlan, and his account of the journey, the Risalah, survives as one of the most vivid ethnographic documents of the early medieval period. Ibn Fadlan encountered a group of Rus traders on the banks of the Volga, and his description of them vibrates with the fascination and revulsion of a sophisticated urban intellectual confronting something utterly alien. He described them as tall as date palms, fair and ruddy, tattooed from fingertips to neck with dark blue or green designs depicting trees, figures, and geometric patterns. Each man, he wrote, carried an axe, a sword, and a knife, and was never parted from his weapons. They were, he noted with undisguised disgust, the filthiest of God's creatures. They did not wash after eating, after defecating, or after sexual intercourse. They shared a single communal bowl of water for washing their faces and hair each morning, each man blowing his nose and spitting into the same basin before passing it to the next. But it was the Rus funeral that seized Ibn Fadlan's attention, and that has seized the imagination of readers ever since. He witnessed the cremation burial of a Rus chieftain, a ceremony so elaborate, so theatrical, and so brutal that his account remains one of the most discussed passages in all of medieval literature. The dead chieftain was placed in a temporary grave for 10 days while preparations were made. His finest ship was hauled ashore and placed on a wooden platform. The ship was furnished with cushions and tapestries, and the dead man was dressed in his finest garments, trousers, stockings, boots, a tunic, and a caftan of gold brocade, with a cap of sable fur. Food and drink were placed beside him. His weapons were laid at his side. A dog was cut in half and thrown into the ship. 2 horses were run until they sweated, then hacked to pieces with swords and thrown in after the dog. 2 cows, a rooster, and a hen followed. Then came the part of the ceremony that Ibn Fadlan recorded with a horror he could not conceal. On the slave girl, a woman who had volunteered for the role or been designated for it, was given intoxicating drink and led from tent to tent, where she was ritually assaulted by each of the dead man's companions. She was then led to the ship, where an old woman called the Angel of Death, Ibn Fadlan uses that phrase, placed a cord around her neck. While 2 men pulled the cord tight, the Angel of Death stabbed her repeatedly between the ribs. The girl's body was placed beside her dead master in the ship. Then the pyre was lit. Ibn Fadlan records that the entire ship was consumed by flames within an hour, reduced to ashes in a wind that he was told had been sent by the dead man's god to carry him swiftly to the afterlife. A Rus man standing beside him turned and spoke through an interpreter. "You Arabs are fools," the man said. "You take the people you love most and put them in the ground, where the worms in the earth consume them. We burn them in an instant, and they enter paradise at once." The account is extraordinary on multiple levels. It confirms, through an entirely independent, non-European source, many details of Norse culture that the Icelandic sagas describe. The ship burial, the grave goods, the ritual sacrifice, the belief that fire released the dead to the afterlife. It also reveals the human cost of that culture with an unflinching clarity that the sagas, composed by and for the Norse themselves, tend to obscure. The slave girl at the center of the ritual, unnamed, voiceless in the historical record except through the eyes of a horrified outsider in Bolas, embodies the violence that underwrote Norse society at every level. The wealth that built the ships, filled the halls, and funded the expeditions was extracted through trade and raiding that depended, at its base, on the labor and bodies of enslaved human beings. Slavery was not incidental to the Viking world. It was structural. The Old Norse word for slave, thrall, entered the English language as a term for captivity and fascination precisely because the institution was so pervasive. Thralls made up a significant percentage of the Scandinavian population, or estimates range from 10 to 30%, though exact figures are impossible to establish. They were captured in raids, purchased in markets, bred in captivity, and traded across the full extent of the Norse commercial network. Irish monks, English farmers, Slavic villagers, Finnic hunters. Anyone unfortunate enough to be in the wrong place when a Norse raiding party arrived could find themselves in chains, transported hundreds or thousands of miles from home, and sold into a life of forced labor from which there was no legal mechanism of escape. The eastern trade routes were particularly dependent on the slave trade. The Volga Bulgars, the Khazars, and the merchants of the Abbasid Caliphate were all avid purchasers of northern slaves. The Arabic word for slave, sakaliba, derives from the word for Slav, reflecting the predominant origin of the human commodity flowing south through the river networks. The silver that flowed north to Scandinavia in such enormous quantities was purchased in substantial part with human lives. This is a dimension of the Viking story that resists romanticization, and it must be held in mind alongside every account of Norse exploration, artistry, and state building that follows. The same longships that carried explorers to Greenland and Vinland carried slaves to Dublin and the Volga. The same silver arm rings that served as currency and status symbols were forged from metal earned through the sale of human beings. The civilization was extraordinary. Its foundations were, in part, built on systematic cruelty. The Rus trading network reached its fullest development in the mid-10th century, under the rule of a dynasty that traced its origins, through legend at least, to a single founding figure. His name, according to the Russian primary chronicle, was Rurik. The chronicle, compiled in Kiev in the early 12th century by monks working from earlier sources, records that in approximately 862, the Slavic and Finnic tribes of the Novgorod region, exhausted by internal warfare, invited a Varangian, in the eastern term for Scandinavian, the prince to come and rule over them. "The land is rich," they supposedly said, "but there is no order in it. Come and reign over us." Whether this invitation actually occurred, or whether the chronicle's authors were providing a polite origin story for what was in reality a straightforward military takeover, is debated. What is clear is that by the late 9th century, a Scandinavian dynasty was firmly established at Novgorod and was extending its control southward along the Dnieper toward Kiev. Rurik's successor, or possibly his kinsman, Oleg captured Kiev around 882 and made it the capital of a new political entity that historians call Kievan Rus. Kiev was a prize worth taking. Perched on bluffs above the Dnieper, it commanded the river route to the Black Sea, and the Black Sea led to the greatest city in the medieval world, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the surviving eastern half of the Roman world. A city of perhaps 500,000 people at a time when London held fewer than 10,000. Its walls, built by the Emperor Theodosius in the 5th century, had never been breached. Its markets overflowed with silk, gold, jewels, and spices drawn from trade routes that stretched to China and India. Its churches blazed with mosaics of gold and lapis lazuli. Its emperor sat on a golden throne flanked by mechanical golden lions that roared and golden birds that sang, automata designed to overawe visiting barbarians with the glory of Roman civilization. The Rus wanted access to this city and its markets. They were willing to fight for it. In 860, a Rus fleet appeared in the waters of the Bosphorus, the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia, and that provided the only sea approach to Constantinople. The attack came while the Byzantine Emperor Michael III was away campaigning against the Abbasid Caliphate, and the city was lightly defended. The Rus ravaged the suburbs and the surrounding coastline, spreading terror through a capital that had not faced a serious seaborne assault in centuries. Byzantine sources describe the panic in apocalyptic terms. The Patriarch Photius preached sermons comparing the Rus to the biblical scourge of Gog and Magog, a punishment sent by God for the sins of the Christian world. The attack ultimately failed. In Byzantine accounts credit the city's salvation to divine intervention. A sacred relic, the robe of the Virgin Mary, was reportedly dipped in the waters of the Bosphorus, summoning a storm that scattered the Rus fleet. Whether the storm was providential or meteorological, the Rus withdrew. But they had announced their presence on the Byzantine stage, and they would return. In 907, Oleg led a massive expedition against Constantinople, 2,000 ships, according to the Russian primary chronicle, though the number is almost certainly inflated. The Byzantines responded not with force, but with diplomacy. A commercial treaty was negotiated, granting the Rus favorable trading rights in Constantinople, access to the city's markets, provisions for Rus merchants during their stay, and reduced customs duties on their goods. The treaty was renewed and expanded under Oleg's successors, Igor and Olga, each round of negotiation following the same pattern. A Rus military demonstration, followed by a Byzantine diplomatic concession, followed by a period of profitable peace. The trade that flowed through this relationship was transformative for the Rus. Furs, slaves, wax, and honey moved south. Silk, gold, wine, fruit, and manufactured goods moved north. Byzantine cultural influence flowed along the same channels: art, architecture, religious ideas, administrative practices, The Rus elite draped themselves in Byzantine silk, drank Byzantine wine, and increasingly found themselves drawn to the Byzantine version of Christianity with its magnificent liturgy, its imperial associations, and its promise of divine legitimacy for earthly rule. The decisive moment came in 988, under Vladimir, the great-grandson of Rurik, who had consolidated his control over the Rus territories through a campaign of fratricide, military conquest, and strategic marriage. Vladimir, according to the primary chronicle, sent envoys to investigate the major religions of his neighbors: Islam among the Volga Bulgars, Judaism among the Khazars, Latin Christianity among the Germans, and Orthodox Christianity among the Byzantines. The envoys reported back. The Muslims forbade alcohol, which Vladimir reportedly found unacceptable. Drinking, he is said to have declared, is the joy of the Rus. The Jewish Khazars had lost their homeland, which seemed like poor advertisement for their God's favor. The German churches were unimpressive, but in Constantinople, the envoys had attended a service in the Hagia Sophia, and the experience had overwhelmed them. We did not know, they reported, whether we were in heaven or on earth, for on earth there is no such beauty. We cannot describe it. We only know that God dwells there among men. The story is too neat to be fully historical. It reads like a diplomatic justification composed after the fact to give a political decision the appearance of spiritual revelation. Vladimir's actual motivations were strategic. He needed a Byzantine alliance. The Byzantine Emperor Basil II needed Rus military support against a rebellion. A deal was struck. Vladimir would supply 6,000 Varangian warriors for the emperor's personal guard. In return, he would receive the emperor's sister Anna in marriage, an almost unthinkable honor for a barbarian king. The condition was that Vladimir accept baptism. Vladimir was baptized in 988. He ordered the mass baptism of the population of Kiev in the Dnieper River. The wooden idols of the Old Norse and Slavic gods were pulled down, dragged through the streets, and thrown into the river. Christianity, in its Byzantine Orthodox form, became the official religion of the Rus state. The conversion was more than a change of faith. It was a civilizational reorientation. With Christianity came literacy. The Cyrillic alphabet, developed by Byzantine missionaries, became the medium of Rus written culture. With Christianity came architecture. Stone churches modeled on Byzantine prototypes began to rise in Kiev, Novgorod, and other major centers. With Christianity came a new theory of political authority. The prince was no longer merely a successful warlord distributing plunder. He was God's representative on earth, ruling by divine sanction and accountable to a moral law that transcended the customs of the warrior hall. The 6,000 Varangian warriors that Vladimir sent to Constantinople became the nucleus of one of the most famous military units in medieval history, the Varangian Guard. This elite force of Scandinavian and later Anglo-Saxon mercenaries served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor for the next 2 centuries. They were chosen precisely because they were foreigners. Men with no ties to the Byzantine aristocracy, no involvement in court factions, no loyalty except to the emperor who paid them. They were spectacularly well compensated, and their reputation for ferocity and incorruptibility made service in the Varangian Guard one of the most coveted military positions in the northern world. Young Scandinavian warriors traveled thousands of miles for the opportunity to serve in Constantinople, and those who returned came back wealthy, worldly, and marked by experiences utterly unlike anything available at home. Runic inscriptions in Scandinavia commemorate men who went east to the service of the emperor. One famous runic inscription in the Hagia Sophia itself, scratched into a marble balustrade by a bored guardsman, reads simply, "Halfdan was here," a Viking name, carved into the greatest church in Christendom by a Scandinavian warrior standing guard over the heir of Rome. It is an image that captures the entire arc of the Eastern Viking experience. The long journey from the Baltic to the Bosphorus, the transformation from pagan raider to Christian soldier, and the characteristic Norse habit of leaving a mark wherever they went. But the eastern expansion of the Norse world, for all its scale and consequence, was only one arm of a reach that extended in every direction simultaneously. While the Rus were building their river empire through the forests of Eastern Europe, and while the Danes and Norwegians were conquering and settling the British Isles, another current of Norse expansion was pushing north and west into waters where no European had ever sailed, toward lands that no European knew existed. The North Atlantic expansion of the Norse is, in many ways, the most extraordinary chapter of the Viking story. It required no conquering army, no diplomatic negotiation, no trade network. It required only ships, nerve, and a willingness to sail into open ocean with no certainty of what lay beyond the horizon. The first step was the shortest. The Faroe Islands, Vikings, a cluster of 18 small, windswept islands roughly midway between Norway and Iceland, were settled by Norse farmers beginning around 825, possibly earlier. Irish monks may have been there first, seeking the same solitude that had drawn their predecessors to Lindisfarne and Iona, but if so, they left when the Norse arrived. The Faroes offered grazing land for sheep, abundant seabirds for food, and a stepping stone into the deeper Atlantic. They were harsh, isolated, and beautiful. Steep green islands rising from gray seas, their cliff faces white with nesting gannets, their valleys carved by streams running amber with peat. A man could farm there if he did not mind the wind. From the Faroes, the next step was longer. Roughly 400 miles of open ocean to the northwest across some of the most dangerous waters in the North Atlantic. The destination was an island so large that it took days to sail along its coast, an island of fire and ice that would become the most remarkable social experiment in the Viking world. Iceland. The settlement of Iceland, beginning around 870, was driven by the same forces that drove Norse expansion everywhere: land hunger, political ambition, and the restless energy of men who found their home territories too crowded or too constrained. But Iceland's settlement had an additional driver that was specific to its time and place. In Norway, the late 9th century saw the consolidation of royal power under Harald Fairhair, a chieftain from southwestern Norway who fought a series of wars to bring the independent fjord communities under a single crown. His victory at the naval battle of Hafrsfjord, dated by tradition to approximately 872, established the first Norwegian kingdom. But it also created a class of dispossessed chieftains and freemen who found life under a centralized monarchy intolerable. These men went to Iceland. Not all of them, and not only them, the settlement drew participants from across the Norse world, including the Norse communities in Ireland and Scotland. But the Icelandic sagas, composed centuries later, preserve a powerful founding narrative. Iceland was settled by men who valued their independence above everything, who would rather farm a volcanic island in the middle of the North Atlantic than bend the knee to a king. The island they found was unlike anything in their experience. Vast, roughly the size of Ireland, but overwhelmingly uninhabitable. Glaciers covered a tenth of its surface. Active volcanoes erupted with terrifying unpredictability, filling the sky with ash and covering the land with lava. The interior was a desert of black sand and broken rock, impassable and lifeless. But along the coast, particularly in the south and west, there were valleys with grassy lowlands fed by glacial rivers, sheltered from the worst of the wind with enough pasture to support cattle and sheep. The settlers claimed these valleys, i.e., established farms, and created a society from nothing. What they built was unprecedented. Iceland had no king. It had no central government. It had no army, no police, no prisons, and no taxation. What it had was the Althing, a general assembly established around 930 that met annually at Thingvellir, a dramatic rift valley in southwestern Iceland where the European and North American tectonic plates pull apart and the earth itself cracks open. At the Althing, the free men of Iceland gathered to settle disputes, make law, hear cases, conduct trade, arrange marriages, and renew the social bonds that held their scattered communities together. The laws were not written down. Not at first. They were memorized and recited by a man called the law speaker, who was required to declaim the entire body of Icelandic law over the course of 3 consecutive annual assemblies. The law was living, oral, and public. Anyone could hear it, anyone could invoke it, and no one was above it. Disputes were settled through a combination of legal argument, arbitration, and the implicit threat of violence by the aggrieved parties' kinship network. Justice was not enforced by the state because there was no state. It was enforced by the community through a system of honor, obligation, and collective memory that made reputation the most valuable possession a person could hold. This was not a democracy in any modern sense. Power was concentrated in the hands of the Godar, the chieftain priests who controlled access to the legal system and whose support was essential for any man seeking justice. Women could not participate in the Althing. Slaves had no legal standing at all. The system was stratified, patriarchal, and sometimes violent. The sagas are filled with feuds that escalated from insult to lawsuit to killing to counter-killing in spirals that could consume entire families over generations. But it was also within its own terms a society of remarkable legal sophistication. The Icelandic law codes, when they were finally written down in the 12th and 13th centuries, reveal a legal system that addressed property rights, inheritance, marriage, divorce, assault, theft, slander, and dozens of other matters with a precision and nuance that compares favorably with contemporary legal systems anywhere in Europe. Divorce, notably, was available to women as well as men. A woman could divorce her husband for reasons including physical abuse, financial irresponsibility, and even for wearing a shirt with too low a neckline, which was considered effeminate. The provision seems almost humorous to modern eyes, but it reflects a society that took gender roles seriously enough to legislate them while also granting women a degree of legal agency that was unusual in the medieval world. Iceland also produced something that no other Viking settlement produced, a literature. The Icelandic sagas, composed in the 13th and 14th centuries but drawing on oral traditions that reach back to the settlement period, are among the greatest literary achievements of the medieval world. Written in spare, declarative prose that modern readers find startlingly accessible, the sagas tell the stories of the founding families of Iceland, their feuds, their loves, their voyages, their legal disputes, their moments of heroism and cowardice and dark humor. Njál's saga, Egil's saga, Laxdæla saga, the saga of Grettir the Strong. These are not chronicles or annals. They are fully realized narrative art with complex characters, psychological depth, and a tragic sensibility that owes nothing to classical or Christian literary models. The sagas preserve in literary form the memory of a society that believed it could govern itself without kings. That experiment lasted for more than 3 centuries, from the founding of the Althing around 930 to Iceland's submission to the Norwegian crown in 1262. It was imperfect, violent, and ultimately unsustainable. But it remains one of the most distinctive political creations of the medieval world, and its literary legacy has outlived every kingdom that the Vikings built by force of arms. From Iceland, the Norse looked west, and what they found there would stretch the boundaries of the known world to their absolute limit. But that final reach into the unknown, the voyages to Greenland and beyond, to a land the Norse called Vinland, on the shores of a continent that Europe would not rediscover for another 500 years, belongs to a later chapter of this story. Before we follow the longships into the western Atlantic, we must return to the heartland of the Viking world, to Scandinavia itself, where the forces that had launched the Viking Age were now transforming the lands the Vikings had left behind. Kings were rising, borders were forming, and the old world of independent chieftains and raiding expeditions was giving way to something new, something that looked for the first time like the beginnings of nations. The transformation of Scandinavia from a landscape of competing chieftains into a collection of recognizable kingdoms was not a single event, but a slow, bloody, and frequently reversed process that unfolded across the entire span of the Viking Age. The same outward energy that sent longships to the shores of England, Ireland, Francia, and Byzantium also turned inward, as ambitious men sought to consolidate the fragmented power structures of their homelands into something larger, more durable, and more personally profitable. Denmark led the way. Its geography, flatter, more connected, more densely settled than Norway or Sweden, made centralization easier, and its proximity to the Frankish kingdoms of the continent provided both a model of organized kingship and a constant military threat that rewarded unified command. By the late 8th century, a Danish king named Godfred was powerful enough to challenge Charlemagne himself, raiding Frankish territory, destroying the Slavic trading town of Rarik on the Baltic coast, and constructing the Danevirke, a massive earthwork fortification stretching across the base of the Jutland Peninsula designed to block Frankish invasion from the south. The Danevirke was not the work of a petty chieftain. It was an engineering project that required the coordinated labor of thousands, directed by a central authority capable of commanding resources on a scale that no Scandinavian ruler had previously demonstrated. Godfred was murdered in 810, and the decades that followed saw Denmark convulsed by the same dynastic warfare that plagued every early medieval kingdom. The throne passed between rival branches of the royal family through assassination, exile, and civil war, with Frankish emperors occasionally intervening to support one claimant against another. But the institution of Danish kingship survived these upheavals, and by the mid-10th century it had produced a ruler who would transform not only Denmark, but the entire trajectory of Scandinavian history. His name was Harald Bluetooth. The nickname, according to later tradition, he referred either to a dead tooth that had turned dark or to his fondness for blueberries, though the true origin is lost. What is not lost is the scale of his achievement. Harald unified Denmark under a single crown, extended Danish control over much of Norway, and, most consequentially, accepted Christian baptism, bringing his kingdom into the religious and political orbit of Latin Christendom. The conversion of Denmark was not a sudden spiritual awakening. It was a calculated political maneuver executed under pressure from the Holy Roman Empire to the south. The German Emperor Otto I had defeated Harald in battle and made Christian conversion a condition of peace. But Harald turned the imposed conversion to his own advantage with characteristic shrewdness. Christianity came with literacy, with administrative structures developed over centuries by the Roman Church, with a network of bishops and monasteries that could serve as instruments of royal authority, and with the ideological framework of divinely sanctioned kingship that no pagan chieftain system could match. A pagan king ruled by personal prowess and the consent of his warriors. A Christian king ruled by the will of God, and anyone who opposed him opposed not merely a man, but the cosmic order itself. Harald commemorated his achievements on a massive runestone erected at Jelling, in central Jutland, alongside the burial mounds of his parents. The Jelling Stone, sometimes called the birth certificate of Denmark, bears an inscription in runic characters that declares, "With the directness characteristic of Norse monumental art, Harald King ordered these memorials made for Gorm his father and Thera his mother. That Harald who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian." The stone's carved images are as significant as its text. One face depicts a great lion entwined with a serpent, a motif drawn from Norse decorative tradition. The other face depicts Christ on the cross, surrounded by interlacing patterns that blend Christian iconography with Scandinavian artistic style. The Jelling Stone is, in miniature, a portrait of the cultural transformation that was reshaping the Norse world. The old and the new, pagan and Christian, Norse and European, intertwined on the same monument, each shaping the other. Harald Bluetooth died around 986. He killed, according to some accounts, by his own son, Sweyn Forkbeard, in a rebellion that followed the familiar pattern of Norse dynastic violence. Sweyn, once established on the Danish throne, turned his attention outward with an ambition that dwarfed anything his father had attempted. The late 10th and early 11th centuries saw a dramatic resurgence of Scandinavian military activity in the British Isles. A second wave of Viking aggression that was larger, better organized, and more strategically sophisticated than anything the 9th century had produced. The targets had changed. The scattered monasteries that had drawn the first raiders were no longer the primary objective. The target now was England itself, not to raid but to rule. England by the 990s. All had been unified into a single kingdom through the work of Alfred's descendants. The West Saxon dynasty had spent the better part of a century reconquering the Danelaw, absorbing the Norse-settled territories into an increasingly centralized English state with a sophisticated system of coinage, taxation, and local administration. It was, by the standards of the age, a wealthy and well-governed kingdom. And wealth, in a world where Scandinavian kings were building expensive armies and competing for dominance, was an irresistible magnet. The renewed attacks began in earnest in 991 when a Norse fleet descended on the Essex coast and confronted an English force at the Battle of Maldon. The battle produced one of the finest surviving works of Old English literature, a poem that captures in vivid alliterative verse the heroism and futility of the English defense. The English leader, Ealdorman Bertnoth, was killed, and the Norse were victorious. The English king, Ethelred, later known as Ethelred the Unready, a nickname that does not mean unprepared but rather poorly counseled, a pun on his name, which meant noble counsel, responded by paying tribute. 10,000 pounds of silver, the first of what would become a series of increasingly enormous Danegeld payments that drained the English treasury and demonstrated to every Norse warlord in Scandinavia that England could be milked like a compliant cow. The payments escalated with sickening regularity. 16,000 pounds in 994, 24,000 pounds in 1002, 36,000 pounds in 1007, 48,000 pounds in 1012. Each payment bought a temporary withdrawal. And each withdrawal was followed by a return because the payments themselves were the incentive for returning. The economics were simple and devastating. Why conquer England through costly warfare when England would pay you not to fight? But Ethelred did not merely pay, he also panicked. In November of 1002, he ordered the massacre of all Danes living in England, in the St. Brice's Day massacre, an act of ethnic violence so indiscriminate and so counterproductive that it seems almost designed to provoke the very catastrophe it sought to prevent. Among the victims, according to later tradition, was Gunhilda, the sister of Svein Forkbeard, king of Denmark. Whether Gunhilda's death was the personal motivation or merely a convenient justification, Sweyn's response was comprehensive. He launched a systematic campaign of conquest that ground through England over the next decade, defeating English armies, sacking English towns, and methodically dismantling Ethelred's capacity to resist. In 1013, Sweyn crossed to England with a full invasion force, and the English kingdom collapsed with startling speed. Town after town submitted. The Danelaw, with its population of Anglo-Danish descent, welcomed him. London held out briefly, then capitulated. Ethelred fled to Normandy, to the court of his wife's family, the descendants of yet another group of Norse settlers who had established themselves on the continent a century earlier. Svein Forkbeard was acclaimed King of England on Christmas Day 1013. He held the throne for 5 weeks. On February 3, 1014, Sweyn died suddenly, of illness, or possibly of a fall from his horse. The Danish army in England acclaimed his son Cnut as his successor, but Cnut was young. His position in England was not yet secure, and the English council, seizing the opportunity, invited Ethelred back from exile. Cnut withdrew to Denmark to consolidate his position and gather a larger force. He returned in 1015 with an army of 10,000 men and a fleet of 200 ships, one of the largest military expeditions of the entire Viking Age. The campaign that followed was brutal, methodical, and decisive. Ethelred died in April of 1016, and his son Edmund Ironside fought a desperate series of battles against Cnut through the spring and summer. The two men eventually agreed to divide England between them, Edmund taking Wessex and Cnut taking the rest. It was a temporary arrangement. Edmund died in November of 1016, and barely 6 months after his father and Cnut became undisputed king of all England, he was perhaps 20 years old. Cnut's reign over England from 1016 to 1035 represents something that would have been unimaginable to the monks of Lindisfarne 2 centuries earlier. A Danish Viking sitting on the English throne, ruling not as a foreign conqueror but as a legitimate Christian king, maintaining English laws, patronizing English churches, and governing through the existing English administrative system with a competence that many of his English-born predecessors had failed to achieve. Cnut understood that conquering England and ruling England were entirely different enterprises, and he approached the second with the same strategic intelligence he had applied to the first. He married Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow, binding himself to the existing English dynasty through the most intimate of political alliances. He retained many of Ethelred's administrators and officials, maintaining continuity of governance even as the man at the top had changed. He patronized the English church lavishly, endowing monasteries, attending religious ceremonies with conspicuous devotion, and presenting himself as a defender of Christian civilization rather than its destroyer. He made a pilgrimage to Rome in 1027, meeting the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor and securing trading concessions and toll reductions for English and Danish merchants and pilgrims. The act of a sophisticated statesman, not a barbarian warlord. The famous story of Cnut and the waves, the king who commanded the tide to halt and was, of course, ignored by the sea, has been misunderstood for centuries. Popular memory remembers it as a tale of royal arrogance. The original story, as recorded by the 12th century chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, carries the opposite meaning. Cnut set his throne on the beach and commanded the waves to stop specifically to demonstrate to his fawning courtiers that the power of kings was nothing compared to the power of God. When the waves soaked his feet and legs, he turned to his court and declared that they should know that the power of kings is empty and worthless, and that no one is worthy of the name of king except he whose will the heavens, earth, and sea obey. He reportedly never wore his crown again, placing it instead on the head of a crucifix. It is a story of humility, not hubris, and it reveals a man who understood the limits of earthly authority with a clarity that his Viking predecessors would have found bewildering. But Cnut was not merely king of England. He was simultaneously king of Denmark, and when his brother-in-law Olaf Haraldsson was driven from the Norwegian throne, Cnut extended his control over Norway as well. For a brief period in the late 1020s and early 1030s, Cnut ruled a North Sea empire that encompassed England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden, the largest dominion any Scandinavian ruler had ever assembled, and a political entity that placed the North Sea at the center of a unified northern European state rather than at its periphery. The empire did not survive him. Cnut died in 1035, at approximately 40 years of age, and his sons proved unable to hold together what their father had built. Harold Harefoot took England and died in 1040. Harthacnut took Denmark and then England and died in 1042, allegedly collapsing at a wedding feast. With Harthacnut's death, the Danish dynasty in England ended, and the English council chose Edward, the surviving son of Ethelred and Emma of Normandy, as king. Edward, later known as Edward the Confessor for his conspicuous piety, had spent most of his life in exile in Normandy, and his accession restored the old West Saxon dynasty to the English throne. But the Norman connections that Edward brought with him would prove fateful in ways that no one could have predicted. The stage was being set through a series of dynastic coincidences and broken promises for one final, a cataclysmic collision between the Viking world and the English kingdom that Alfred had built. That collision would come in 1066, in the year that changed everything, but it was still a generation away. Norway's path to unified kingship was bloodier and more contested than Denmark's, shaped by the extreme geography that made centralized control so difficult. The fjord-carved coastline that had bred independent communities resisted political consolidation with the same stubbornness that it resisted easy travel. Every fjord was a potential stronghold, every island a refuge for a chieftain who refused to bend. Harald Fairhair's victory at Hafrsfjord in the late 9th century had established the principle of Norwegian kingship, but his successors struggled to maintain it. The kingdom fragmented repeatedly, with rival claimants dividing the country between them or ruling different regions simultaneously. The process of true unification took the better part of 2 centuries and consumed dozens of kings, most of whom died violently. 2 of these kings stand out not merely for their political achievements, but for the role they played in the Christianization of Norway, a process that was, if anything, even more contested and more violent than in Denmark. Olaf Tryggvason, who ruled Norway from approximately 995 to 1000, was a convert to Christianity who pursued the conversion of his kingdom with the zeal of a man who had found certainty and could not tolerate doubt. He had been baptized in England during the same period when he was leading raids on the English coast, and his conversion appears to have been genuine. Though it was also politically convenient, aligning him with the powerful Christian kingdoms of Europe and distinguishing him from the pagan chieftains who were his domestic rivals. Olaf's methods of conversion were not subtle. He offered the chieftains of Norway a choice: baptism or battle. Those who chose battle generally lost. Those who chose baptism were sometimes sincere and sometimes merely prudent. The distinction mattered less to Olaf than the outcome. Olaf Tryggvason died at the Battle of Svolder in the year 1000, fighting against a coalition of the Danish king, the Swedish king, and a Norwegian chieftain who had allied against him. The battle was a naval engagement, fought, fittingly, on the water that had made the Norse what they were. Olaf's ship, the Long Serpent, was reportedly the largest warship ever built in Norway, and the battle raged across its decks until Olaf, surrounded and outnumbered, leapt from the stern into the sea. His body was never recovered. Some said he had drowned. Others insisted he had escaped, swimming beneath the ships to reach safety, and would one day return. The legend of the king who might not be dead persisted for decades. A Norse echo of the Arthurian tradition, the once and future king waiting beyond the horizon. Olaf Haraldsson, who ruled Norway from 1015 to 1028, continued the work of Christianization with equal determination and even greater violence. He is the man who would become, after his death, Saint Olaf, the patron saint of Norway, whose cult became the spiritual center of Norwegian national identity for centuries. But in life, he was a hard, ruthless, and often cruel king who enforced conversion through torture, mutilation, and execution. Chieftains who clung to the old gods had their eyes gouged out, their tongues cut, or their hands severed. The methods were effective. Within a generation, Norway was formally Christian. But Olaf Haraldsson's heavy-handed rule generated enormous resentment among the Norwegian aristocracy. And when Cnut of Denmark and England turned his attention to Norway, Olaf found himself abandoned by his own chieftains. He was driven into exile in 1028 and returned in 1030 with a small force to reclaim his throne. At the Battle of Stiklestad on July 29, 1030, Olaf was killed by an army of Norwegian chieftains allied with Cnut. His body was buried in a sandbank near Nidaros, modern Trondheim, and within a year, miracles were being reported at his grave. His body was exhumed, found to be uncorrupted, and declared holy. The man who had been driven from his throne by his own people was, in death, elevated to the status of eternal king. The church built over his grave became Nidaros Cathedral, the spiritual heart of medieval Norway, and the cult of St. Olaf spread across the entire Norse world, from Iceland to Constantinople, from Dublin to Novgorod. The irony was complete. The Viking who had forced Christianity on Norway at sword point became, in death, the Christian saint who gave Norway its identity. The warrior culture that had valued death in battle above all things found its ultimate expression not in Valhalla, but in a Christian reliquary. the old world and the new fused at Stiklestad, and what emerged was something neither fully pagan nor fully medieval, but distinctly, recognizably Norwegian. Sweden's unification was the slowest and most gradual of the three Scandinavian kingdoms, reflecting a geography that was even more fragmented and a political culture that was even more resistant to centralization than Norway's. The Swedish interior, with its vast forests, its thousands of lakes, and its scattered agricultural settlements, supported a population that was dispersed, independent, and deeply attached to local traditions of self-governance. The Svea, the people who gave Sweden its name, occupied the region around Lake Mälaren in east-central Sweden, where the trading town of Birka had flourished as a hub of Baltic commerce since the 8th century. South of the Svea were the Gotar, a distinct people occupying the provinces of Västergötland and Östergötland, with their own traditions and their own assembly sites. The unification of the Svea and the Gotar into a single Swedish kingdom was a process that was not fully complete until the late 11th or early 12th century, well after Denmark and Norway had achieved recognizable political cohesion. Christianity came to Sweden later than to Denmark or Norway, meeting persistent resistance from a population that maintained the old religious practices with stubborn tenacity. The great temple at Uppsala, described by the 11th century chronicler Adam of Bremen, was reportedly the last major center of Norse pagan worship in Scandinavia. Adam described a golden temple surrounded by a grove of sacred trees, from whose branches hung the sacrificed bodies of men, horses, and dogs. Every 9 years, Adam wrote, a great festival was held, at which 9 males of every living species were sacrificed and their bodies hung in the sacred grove. Whether Adam's account is accurate in its details or colored by Christian horror at pagan practices, it reflects a reality that distinguished Sweden from its neighbors. The old religion held on longer here, and its displacement was correspondingly slower and less violent than in Norway. The Swedish kings who eventually embraced Christianity did so with the same pragmatic calculation that had motivated Harald Bluetooth and Cnut. Christianity brought access to European diplomatic networks, trading privileges with Christian kingdoms, the administrative infrastructure of the church, and the ideological tools of divinely sanctioned monarchy. The costs? The destruction of the old cult sites, in the suppression of traditional practices, the submission to a religious authority centered in Rome, were weighed against the benefits and found acceptable. The temple at Uppsala was destroyed probably in the late 11th century, and a Christian church was built on or near its site. The transition was complete by the end of the 11th century. The political map of Scandinavia had been redrawn. 3 kingdoms, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, stood where dozens of independent chieftaincies had existed 3 centuries earlier. All 3 were Christian. All 3 were integrated to varying degrees into the diplomatic, commercial, and ecclesiastical networks of European civilization. All 3 were governed by hereditary dynasties that ruled through institutions borrowed, adapted, and transformed from models encountered through centuries of contact with the wider world. The Viking Age had not merely produced raiders and traders and settlers. It had produced nations. The men who sailed from the fjords had changed every land they touched, from the bogs of Ireland to the rivers of Russia. But the most profound transformation of all had occurred at home, in the lands they left behind, where the wealth, the knowledge, the religious ideas, and the political models they brought back from their voyages had reshaped Scandinavia itself beyond recognition. The longships still sailed. There were still Norse warriors seeking fortune in foreign lands, still merchants following the old trade routes, still settlers pushing into new territories. But the age of uncoordinated raiding by independent warbands was giving way to something different. The age of organized conquest by Christian kings with national armies, dynastic ambitions, and claims to foreign thrones backed not merely by swords but by genealogical arguments, papal endorsements, and the elaborate machinery of medieval statecraft. The culmination of this transformation, or Mir, the moment when the Viking world and the medieval world collided with shattering finality, was approaching. It would arrive in a single year, on a single island, in 2 battles fought within 3 weeks of each other, each one deciding the fate of a kingdom. The year was 1066, and 3 kings were converging on England. The North Atlantic, in the centuries before Columbus, was not the empty void that later European cartography would suggest. It was a highway, and the Norse had been traveling it for generations, stepping westward from island to island like a man crossing a river on stones, each leap longer and more dangerous than the last. We left the thread of Atlantic expansion at Iceland, that volcanic republic of farmers and lawyers perched on the edge of the habitable world. But Iceland was never the end of the line. It was a way station. The same forces that had driven men from Norway to the Faroes and from the Faroes to Iceland, land hunger, political ambition, the simple restless compulsion to see what lay beyond the next horizon, continued to push westward into waters that grew colder, rougher, and more treacherous with every mile. The man who took the next step was, by all accounts, not a hero. He was a problem. Eric Thorvaldsson, being known to history as Eric the Red, earned his nickname not from any metaphorical quality but from the color of his hair and beard, a vivid, unmistakable red that his contemporaries found worth recording. He was born in Norway around 950, the son of a man named Thorvald Asvaldsson, who had been exiled from Norway for killing someone. The family emigrated to Iceland, where Eric grew up on a marginal farm in the northwest of the island. He inherited his father's temperament. By his mid-30s, he had been involved in multiple feuds and had killed at least 2 men, prompting the Althing to sentence him to 3 years of outlawry, banishment from Iceland, during which time anyone could kill him without legal consequence. Most outlaws skulked along the periphery of Icelandic society, hiding in the highlands and hoping to survive until their sentence expired. Eric did something different. He sailed west. He was not sailing blindly. Norse sailors had known for decades that land existed to the west of Iceland. A man named Gunnbjorn Ulfsson had been blown off course while sailing to Iceland and had sighted a group of islands and a large landmass to the west, though he had not landed. Other sailors had glimpsed the same coastline in clear weather. The existence of land in that direction was not in question. What no one knew was whether it was habitable. Eric spent his 3 years of exile exploring the southwestern coast of a vast island, the largest island in the world, though he could not have known that. He found deep fjords cutting into the coastline. It was surrounded by green valleys that reminded him of the best farmland in Iceland. There was pasture for livestock. There were seals and fish in abundance. The summers were short, but the grass grew thick. The interior was covered by an ice cap of incomprehensible scale, but the coastal strips, particularly in the southwest, were livable. When his exile ended, Eric returned to Iceland with a plan. He wanted settlers. He wanted to establish a colony on the land he had explored, with himself as its leading figure, the prestige and authority that had eluded him in Iceland, where his violent reputation made him a liability, could be his from the founding of a new settlement. And he understood with an instinct for promotion that would have served him well in any era, that the name mattered. He called the place Greenland. The saga of Eric the Red is explicit about his reasoning. He said that people would be more eager to go there if the land had an attractive name. It worked. In 985 or 986, Eric led a fleet of 25 ships carrying approximately 500 settlers, their livestock, their tools, and their household goods westward from Iceland toward the new colony. Only 14 ships completed the crossing. The rest were driven back by storms or lost at sea. The survivors established 2 settlements on the southwestern coast, the eastern settlement and the western settlement, separated by roughly 300 miles of coastline. Greenland was, from the beginning, a precarious enterprise. The settlements were tiny. At their peak, the total Norse population probably never exceeded 5,000 people. The growing season was agonizingly short. Grain could not be cultivated at all. The settlers depended on livestock, hunting, and fishing for sustenance, supplemented by trade with Europe for the grain, iron, timber, and other essentials that Greenland could not produce. The trade goods that Greenland could offer were exotic and valuable. Walrus ivory, narwhal tusks, polar bear skins, live polar bear cubs, and gyrfalcons for the courts of European kings, but the supply was limited, and the journey to market was long and dangerous. The settlers built farms that resembled scaled-down versions of Icelandic homesteads. They built a church. They eventually established a bishop's seat at Gardar in the eastern settlement, complete with a stone cathedral, a bishop's residence with heated floors, and a tithe barn large enough to hold the agricultural surplus of the surrounding farms. They maintained contact with Iceland and Norway through annual trading voyages, clinging to their European identity with the tenacity of people who knew how easily it could be lost. And from Greenland, the Norse took one more step into the unknown. The account comes from two Icelandic sagas, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, composed in the 13th century but describing events that occurred around the year 1000. The two sagas tell overlapping but not identical versions of the same story, disagreeing on details of chronology, personnel, and geography in ways that have kept scholars arguing for a century. But the broad outlines are consistent, and they describe something extraordinary. A merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson, sailing from Iceland to Greenland around 986, was blown off course by a storm and sighted land to the southwest. It's a coastline of forests and low hills that did not match any description of Greenland. Bjarni did not land. He was a merchant, not an explorer, and he wanted to reach his father's farm in Greenland, not investigate unknown coastlines. He turned north and eventually found his way to the settlement, but he talked about what he had seen, and the story reached the ears of a man with the appetite for exploration that Bjarni lacked. Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, purchased Bjarni's ship and sailed west around the year 1000 with a crew of 35 men. He found what Bjarni had described and more. The sagas record 3 distinct landfalls, each given a descriptive name. The first, a barren coast of flat rocks and glaciers, Leif called Helluland, slab land. Hjarnar the second, a forested coast with white sand beaches he called Markland, forest land. The third and most southerly, where he chose to spend the winter, he called Vinland, wineland, or possibly meadowland, depending on the interpretation of the Old Norse prefix. At Vinland, Leif and his crew built temporary shelters and explored the surrounding country. The sagas describe a land of extraordinary abundance, rivers teeming with salmon larger than any they had seen, grass that stayed green deep into the winter, and most famously wild grapes growing in such profusion that one member of the crew, a German named Turker, was found drunk on their juice after wandering off on his own. The identification of Helluland, Markland, and Vinland with specific modern locations has been debated endlessly. Helluland is generally identified with Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic. Markland is usually placed in Labrador. Vinland has been located everywhere from Newfoundland to New England to the Chesapeake Bay, depending on which details of the saga descriptions a given scholar finds most convincing and how liberally one interprets the reference to wild grapes. The debate was largely settled, or at least transformed, in 1960, when a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Stein Ingstad discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at Lonso Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. Excavations conducted through the 1960s and 1970s uncovered the foundations of 8 buildings, including a forge for iron smelting and artifacts that were unmistakably Norse. A bronze cloak pin, wore a spindle whorl of Icelandic soapstone, iron boat rivets, and evidence of iron production using techniques identical to those used in contemporary Scandinavia and Iceland. Radiocarbon dating placed the occupation firmly around the year 1000. Lonso Meadows is the only confirmed Norse site in North America. It was not a permanent settlement, Brulamorainol. The building shows signs of limited occupation, perhaps 2 or 3 seasons at most. The site appears to have been a base camp, a staging point from which expeditions explored further south. Butternuts and butternut wood found at the site do not grow naturally north of New Brunswick. suggesting that the Norse traveled at least several hundred miles south of Lanso Meadows during their explorations. The implications are staggering in their simplicity. 500 years before Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, Norse sailors from Greenland had reached the North American continent, built structures on its soil, smelted iron from its bog ore, and explored its coastline for a distance of hundreds of miles. They were the first Europeans to set foot in the Western Hemisphere. They arrived not as the vanguard of a colonial empire, but as a handful of farmers and sailors from a tiny Greenlandic colony of a few thousand people, extending the same pattern of incremental westward expansion that had carried them from Norway to the Faroes, from the Faroes to Iceland, and from Iceland to Greenland. Why did they not stay? The sagas provide an answer, and it is grimly practical. They encountered indigenous people. The Norse called them skraelings, a term of uncertain but probably derogatory meaning. The initial contacts were sometimes peaceful, involving trade, but they deteriorated into violence. The Norse were vastly outnumbered. Vinland was rich, but it was also inhabited by people who could field far more warriors than any Greenlandic expedition could muster. The sagas describe several skirmishes in which the Norse were driven back to their ships, and the conclusion was inescapable. Vinland could not be held. The cost of defending a permanent settlement against a hostile indigenous population, at the end of a supply line stretching thousands of miles across the North Atlantic, was simply too high. Subsequent expeditions visited Markland to harvest timber, a resource desperately needed in treeless Greenland and Iceland, but no further attempts at settlement were made. The Norse knowledge of lands to the west persisted in Icelandic geographical tradition for centuries, but the window of active exploration closed within a generation of Leif's voyage. Vinland became a story, then a legend, then a half-remembered curiosity in manuscripts that few people read. The Greenland settlements themselves endured far longer than the Vinland adventure, but their story is ultimately one of slow, quiet extinction. The colony persisted for nearly 500 years. The last written record of the Norse Greenlanders dates from 1408, when a marriage was recorded at the church in Valsey, in the eastern settlement. After that, silence. When European ships returned to Greenland in the 16th and 17th centuries, they found the settlements abandoned. The stone churches stood empty. The farms were overgrown, and the people were gone. What happened to the Norse Greenlanders remains one of the most haunting mysteries of the Viking Age. The causes of the colony's failure were almost certainly multiple and reinforcing. The Little Ice Age, a period of climatic cooling that began in the 13th century, shortened the already brief growing season and made the sea passages to Iceland and Norway progressively more dangerous and more often blocked by ice. The trade goods that sustained the colony's connection to Europe, walrus ivory above all, lost their value as cheaper ivory from African elephants became available through Mediterranean trade routes. The Black Death, which swept through Norway in 1349 with catastrophic mortality, may have disrupted the supply ships on which the Greenlanders depended. The Inuit, migrating southward along the Greenland coast as the climate cooled, may have come into conflict with the Norse or simply occupied the hunting grounds on which the colony depended. There is no single dramatic ending, no final battle, no last ship sailing into a storm. There's only a gradual dimming, a community growing smaller and more isolated with each passing decade, until one year the last farm was abandoned and the last family either died or left, and the North Atlantic swallowed the memory of their existence. The ruins at Valsey, a stone church standing roofless against the Greenlandic sky, its walls still solid after 6 centuries, are the most eloquent monument to the Norse Atlantic expansion. They speak of ambition, endurance, and ultimate failure. They speak of the limits of what courage and skill and sheer stubbornness could achieve against the indifference of climate and distance. The Norse did not discover America in the way that Columbus did, as the opening act of a permanent European presence that would transform both hemispheres. They discovered it and then quietly withdrew. Their footprint on the continent was so light that it vanished almost completely, leaving behind a few sagas, one archaeological site, and the knowledge that the Viking reach extended further than anyone had imagined, all the way to the shores of a world that would not be found again for half a millennium. While the Atlantic frontier was reaching its furthest extension and beginning its long retreat, the heartland of the Viking world was approaching its own moment of transformation. And that moment would arrive, as so many pivotal moments in this story have arrived, on the shores of England. The year 1066 is the most famous date in English history, and it is, in a very real sense, the last year of the Viking Age. 3 armies converged on England in the autumn of that year, each led by a man who believed he had a legitimate claim to the English throne. And the battles they fought determined not only who would rule England, but whether the Norse world would continue to shape the destiny of the British Isles or whether a new power would take its place. The crisis was triggered by a death. Edward the Confessor, the pious and childless king who had occupied the English throne since 1042, died on January 5, 1066. He left no heir. The question of who should succeed him had been the subject of competing claims, broken promises, and diplomatic maneuvering for years, and Edward's death transformed a political problem into an immediate military emergency. 3 men believed the throne was theirs. The first was Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, the most powerful nobleman in England, and the man who had effectively governed the kingdom during Edward's declining years. Harold's claim rested on 2 foundations: the support of the English nobility, who elected him king on the day of Edward's death, and a deathbed bequest that he claimed Edward had made in his favor. He was crowned in Westminster Abbey on January 6th, the day after Edward died, in a ceremony of conspicuous haste that reflected the urgency of the situation. The second claimant was William, Duke of Normandy, a descendant of the Norse Viking Rollo who had established the Duchy of Normandy on the French coast in 911. William's claim rested on a promise he said Edward had made years earlier, that William would succeed him on the English throne. William also claimed that Harold himself, during a visit to Normandy in 1064, had sworn an oath recognizing William's right to the succession. Whether this oath was freely given or extracted under duress, Harold had been shipwrecked on the Norman coast and was effectively William's prisoner, was a matter of fierce dispute. What was not in dispute was William's determination to enforce his claim by force. The third claimant was Harald Hardrada, King of Norway. His claim was the most tenuous of the 3, resting on a treaty between his predecessor, Magnus the Good, and Harthacnut, the last Danish king of England, in which, according to Norse sources, each had agreed that if one died without an heir, the other would inherit his kingdom. The legal validity of this claim was questionable at best, but Harald Hardrada was not a man who relied on legal niceties. He was, by 1066, the most experienced and most feared warrior in Northern Europe, a man whose biography reads like a saga even by the extravagant standards of the Viking Age. He had fled Norway as a teenager after his half-brother Olaf Haraldsson was killed at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. He had traveled east to the court of the Kievan Rus, where he served as a mercenary in the retinue of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise. From Kiev, he had journeyed south to Constantinople and enlisted in the Varangian Guard, the elite Scandinavian bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. He fought in campaigns across the Mediterranean, in Anatolia, in Sicily, in Bulgaria, in the Holy Land. He accumulated enormous wealth, partly through his share of military plunder and partly through the Byzantine custom of allowing the Varangian Guard to loot the imperial palace upon the death of an emperor, a privilege Harold reportedly exercised with enthusiasm. He returned to Scandinavia around 1046, used his fortune to secure the Norwegian throne, and spent the next 2 decades consolidating his power and fighting intermittent wars against Denmark. He was in 1066 approximately 50 years old, over 6 feet tall, a giant by medieval standards, and possessed of a military reputation that preceded him like a shockwave. When he decided to invade England, The Norse world treated the expedition as the culmination of everything the Viking Age had been building toward. This was not a raid. This was a king, with a royal army and a royal fleet, sailing to claim a kingdom that the Norse had been fighting over for 3 centuries. Harald Hardrada sailed for England in September of 1066 with a fleet of approximately 300 ships and an army of perhaps 9,000 men. He was joined by Tostig Godwinson, Harald's own brother, who had been exiled from England and was burning for revenge against the sibling who had supplanted him. The combined Norse and rebel force landed in northern England, sailed up the Humber estuary and the River Ouse, and disembarked near the city of York. On September 20th, 1066, Harald Hardrada's army met a combined English force led by the northern earls Edwin and Morcar at the Battle of Fulford, just south of York. The English were crushed. The earls fled. York surrendered. Harald Hardrada had conquered the north of England in a single afternoon. 5 days later, on September 25th, everything changed. Harold Godwinson, the English king, had been in the south, watching the Channel coast for the expected Norman invasion. When news of the Norwegian landing reached him, he made one of the most extraordinary forced marches in military history, covering nearly 200 miles from London to Yorkshire in 4 days, gathering reinforcements as he went. He arrived at Stamford Bridge, 7 miles east of York, on the morning of September 25th, and found Harald Hardrada's army encamped on both sides of the River Derwent, many of them without their armor, enjoying the warm, late September weather and waiting for hostages from the recently surrendered city. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was a slaughter. The English fell on the unprepared Norse with overwhelming force. The fighting raged for hours, initially on the western bank of the river, then across a narrow bridge that a single Norse warrior, his name unrecorded, his legend eternal, held alone against the entire English army until someone floated beneath the bridge in a barrel and stabbed him from below with a spear. Once the English crossed the bridge, the battle became a massacre. Harald Hardrada was killed early in the fighting, struck in the throat by an arrow. Tostig was killed shortly afterward. The Norse army, caught without armor and without formation, was destroyed. Of the 300 ships that had brought Harald Hardrada's army to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Stamford Bridge was the last great Viking invasion of England. It was also, in a very real sense, the last act of the Viking Age itself, the final attempt by a Scandinavian king to seize an English throne through the old methods of ship-borne assault and military conquest. The methods had worked for 3 centuries. At Stamford Bridge, they failed for the last time. Harald Godwinson had no time to celebrate. 3 days after the battle, on September 28th, the wind in the English Channel shifted. William of Normandy's invasion fleet, which had been waiting for weeks for favorable conditions, set sail. 700 ships carrying approximately 7,000 men crossed the Channel overnight and landed at Pevensey, on the Sussex coast, on September 29th. Harold turned his exhausted army south and marched back the way he had come, covering the 200 miles from Yorkshire to Sussex in less than 2 weeks. On October 14, 1066, the two armies met at a ridge near the town of Hastings. The Battle of Hastings lasted most of the day. Harold's English army, fighting on foot in the traditional shield wall formation, held the ridge against repeated Norman cavalry charges and archery volleys. For hours, the outcome was in doubt. The Norman cavalry could not break the shield wall. The English infantry could not descend from the ridge to pursue without losing their defensive advantage. It was a stalemate that favored the defenders. And if Harold's army had held its discipline until nightfall, the result might have been very different. But the discipline broke. Whether through a feigned Norman retreat that lured part of the English line down the ridge in pursuit, or through the gradual exhaustion of men who had marched 400 miles and fought 2 battles in 3 weeks, the shield wall began to fragment. Norman cavalry exploited the gaps. And then, in the late afternoon, Harold Godwinson was killed. The manner of his death is disputed. The famous image from the Bayeux tapestry, a figure clutching an arrow lodged in his eye, may or may not depict Harold, and the tapestry's interpretation has been debated for centuries. What is certain is that Harold died on the field, and with him died the last English-born king of England for more than 3 centuries. William of Normandy, the great-great-great-grandson of a Norse Viking, who had been given a strip of French coastline in exchange for not burning Paris, became William the Conqueror, King of England. The irony is layered so deeply that it resists easy summary. The Viking Age in England ended not with the defeat of the Vikings, but with their victory, twice over. The Norwegian invasion at Stamford Bridge was the last traditional Viking assault, and it was destroyed. But the Norman invasion at Hastings was, in its genealogical origins, also a Viking story. Normandy was a Viking creation. Its ruling dynasty descended from Rollo, the Norse chieftain, who had besieged Paris in 885 and been granted the territory by the French king Charles the Simple in 911. The Normans spoke French, practiced Christianity, fought on horseback, and built castles. But their ancestors had come from the same fjords and the same longships as Harald Hardrada's warriors. When William took the English throne, it was not the end of Norse influence in England. It was its transformation into something new, something that was no longer recognizably Viking, but that carried the genetic and cultural inheritance of the Norse world forward into the medieval future. The year 1066 is the conventional endpoint of the Viking Age, and there are good reasons for the convention. After Stamford Bridge, no Scandinavian army seriously threatened to conquer England again. After Hastings, the political and cultural landscape of the British Isles was transformed in ways that left little room for the old patterns of Norse intervention. The age of the longship raider, the age of the independent warband sailing out from the fjords to take what the sea offered, was finished. But endings in history are never as clean as the dates suggest. The Norse world did not vanish on October 14, 1066. It evolved. The Scandinavian kingdoms that had crystallized during the Viking Age continued to develop, adopting the institutions of medieval European civilization, feudalism, chivalry, cathedral building, crusading, while retaining distinctive traditions that marked them as something apart. The Norse colonies in the Atlantic persisted for centuries. The cultural legacy of the Viking Age, in language, in law, in place names, in genetic heritage, in the stories that people told about themselves and their ancestors, endured far longer than the political and military structures that had created it. The longships were beached. The great halls fell silent. The old gods retreated into the stories that would eventually be written down in Iceland and preserved through the centuries in manuscripts that survived fire, damp, and neglect by the narrowest of margins. But the world the Vikings made did not disappear with them. It was woven into the fabric of every land they had touched, every river they had navigated, every coastline they had raided or settled or merely glimpsed from the deck of a passing ship. And the full reckoning of what they left behind, the legacy that connects the Viking Age to the modern world, requires one final accounting. The legacy of the Vikings is not a single thread, it is a web, stretching across languages and legal systems, across the DNA of millions of people who have never seen a fjord. You could cross the political boundaries of nations that did not exist when the first longship slid into the water. To trace that web is to discover that the Viking Age did not end so much as dissolve. Its energies absorbed into the civilizations it had alternately terrorized and enriched, its contributions so thoroughly integrated into the structures of the medieval and modern world that they became invisible, mistaken for things that had always been there. Begin with language. The English language, as spoken today by more than 1 billion people worldwide, carries within it a Scandinavian inheritance so deep that most speakers are entirely unaware of it. The Danelaw settlement of the 9th and 10th centuries brought tens of thousands of Danish-speaking settlers into the heart of England, and their language did not simply coexist with Old English, it merged with it in a process of linguistic fusion that fundamentally altered the structure and vocabulary of the English tongue. The Old Norse words that entered English during this period are not exotic borrowings from the margins of the lexicon. They are among the most basic, most frequently used words in the language. Sky, skin, skull, egg, window, husband, wrong, happy, ugly, anger, die, take, give, get, call, want. The pronoun they, along with them and their, is Scandinavian, replacing the Old English forms that had become confusingly similar to other pronouns. The word law itself is Norse. So is outlaw, so is bylaw. The legal vocabulary of English, the language in which rights and obligations are defined and enforced, Mute is partly written in the tongue of the people who invaded and settled the country 1,000 years ago. Place names tell the same story with geographic precision. Across northern and eastern England, the landscape is annotated in Old Norse. Every village ending in Bydsees, Darby, Whitby, Grimsby, Selby, Wetherby, takes its suffix from the Norse word for farmstead or settlement. Every place ending in Thorpe, Cleethorpes, Scunthorpe, Althorpe, uses the Norse word for a secondary or outlying settlement. The Thwaite ending, meaning a clearing or meadow, Braithwaite, Slaithwaite, Langthwaite, is equally Norse. The Beck suffix for a stream, the Fell suffix for a hill, the Dale suffix for a valley, all Norse, all preserved in the modern map of England like a palimpsest, the older Scandinavian text showing through the later English one. In Scotland, the Norse presence left an even more dramatic linguistic and cultural imprint. The Orkney and Shetland Islands, closer to Norway than to Edinburgh, were under direct Norse control for more than 6 centuries, longer than they have been part of Scotland. The local dialect of Scots that developed in these islands, known as Norn, was essentially a form of Old Norse that persisted as a living language until the 18th century. Even today, the place names of Orkney and Shetland are overwhelmingly Norse, and the cultural traditions of the islands retain Scandinavian elements that have no parallel elsewhere in the British Isles. The annual Uphelly AA Fire Festival in Lerwick, Shetland, in which a full-sized replica Viking longship is burned in a torchlight procession, is a 19th century invention, rather than a survival of genuine Norse practice. But it reflects a community that identifies with its Scandinavian heritage more readily than with its Scottish one. Ireland's Norse inheritance is concentrated in its cities. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick, the 5 major urban centers established by Norse settlers in the 9th and 10th centuries, remain the principal cities of Ireland to this day. Before the Norse arrived, Ireland had no towns. The entire concept of urban settlement, of a permanent community organized around trade rather than agriculture, was introduced to Ireland by Scandinavian settlers. The medieval street plans of these cities, their harbor locations, and their roles as centers of commerce and administration, all trace directly to the Norse long forts and trading settlements from which they grew. The words smithy for a forge, girth for an enclosure, and dozens of other Irish-English words preserve Norse origins. The genetic legacy is equally persistent. DNA studies have identified Scandinavian ancestry in the populations of Dublin and the other Norse-founded cities at rates significantly higher than in the rural Irish population. In Normandy, the Viking inheritance underwent its most dramatic transformation. The Norse settlers who followed Rollo into the territory granted by Charles the Simple in 911 abandoned their Scandinavian language within 2 or 3 generations, adopting the French of their neighbors with a thoroughness that left almost no Norse vocabulary in the Norman dialect. But the energy, the administrative talent, and the martial ambition that had characterized the Norse world found new expression through Norman French culture. The Normans became the most dynamic military and political force in 11th and 12th century Europe, conquering England, southern Italy, and Sicily, establishing crusader states in the Holy Land, and building castles, cathedrals, and administrative systems that shaped the political geography of Europe for centuries. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 was, in this sense, the Viking Age's final and most consequential act of transformation. The administrative system that William the Conqueror imposed on England, the feudal hierarchy, the Domesday Book census, the network of castles and sheriffdom being combined Norman organizational genius with the existing Anglo-Saxon administrative infrastructure that Alfred and his successors had built. The result was one of the most effectively governed kingdoms in medieval Europe, a state whose institutions evolved, over centuries, into the constitutional monarchy and common law system that England would eventually export to a quarter of the globe. The roots of that system reach back, through tangled and indirect paths, to both the Anglo-Saxon burhs and the Norse thing assemblies, to both Alfred's law codes and the Danelaw's legal customs. The legal legacy is particularly striking. The concept of the jury trial, citizens judging their peers, has been traced by some legal historians to Scandinavian influence on English law, though the precise mechanisms of transmission are debated. What is beyond dispute is that the Danelaw operated under a distinct legal system that emphasized collective judgment, local participation, and the resolution of disputes through structured legal processes rather than through the unilateral decisions of a lord or king. The English common law system that emerged from the fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Norse legal traditions was not identical to either of its parent systems, but it carried elements of both, and its influence through the British Empire and the American legal system has shaped the legal frameworks of nations on every continent. In Russia, the Viking legacy cuts even deeper, embedded in the very name of the nation and the founding mythology of its state. The Rurikid dynasty, being descended, at least in legend, from the Varangian prince who was invited to rule at Novgorod in 862, governed Russia for more than 700 years, from the 9th century to the death of the last Rurikid Tsar, Fyodor I, in 1598. The dynasty survived the Mongol invasion, the fragmentation of Kievan Rus into rival principalities, and the rise of Moscow as the dominant center of Russian power. Ivan the Terrible, who proclaimed himself the first Tsar of all Russia in 1547, was a Rurikid. The political culture he embodied, centralized autocracy, suspicion of the aristocracy, territorial expansion as a governing imperative, owed more to Mongol and Byzantine models than to Norse ones, but the dynasty's Scandinavian origin remained part of its founding narrative, invoked when useful and ignored when inconvenient. The debate over the role of the Varangians in the formation of the Russian state, the so-called Normanist controversy, has been one of the most politically charged historical arguments of the modern era. Were the Rus fundamentally Scandinavian interlopers who imposed order on disorganized Slavic tribes, as the Normanist school argues? Or were the Slavic societies of the region already developing towards statehood on their own, with the Varangians playing a marginal or catalytic role that has been exaggerated by later sources, as the anti-Normanist school contends? The debate has never been purely academic. Russian national identity, particularly during periods of political tension with Western Europe, has been sensitive to any narrative that credits foreigners with the creation of the Russian state. In Soviet-era, historians suppressed the Normanist interpretation as politically unacceptable. Post-Soviet scholars have engaged the evidence more freely, though the question remains contested. The archaeological evidence suggests a more nuanced reality than either extreme position allows. The Scandinavian presence in early Rus was real, significant, and well documented. The grave goods, the runic inscriptions, the distinctive Scandinavian artifacts found at Novgorod, Staraya Ladoga, and Kiev leave no doubt that Norse traders and warriors were present in significant numbers, but the Slavic and Finnic populations among whom they settled were not passive recipients of foreign rule. They had their own social structures, their own economic networks, their own cultural traditions. The Rus state emerged from the interaction of these populations, Scandinavian, Slavic, Finnic, Baltic, in a process of cultural fusion that paralleled what was happening simultaneously in the Danelaw, in Ireland, and in Normandy. The Norse did not create Russia. They were one ingredient in a mixture from which Russia emerged. The Orthodox Christianity that Vladimir adopted in 988 became the defining cultural institution of Russian civilization, and its adoption was, as we have seen, directly connected to the Varangian relationship with Constantinople. The Cyrillic alphabet, the liturgical traditions, the architectural styles, the iconographic conventions, the political theology of the Byzantine world, all flowed into the Rus lands through channels that the Norse had opened and maintained. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, Russian theologians and rulers claimed Moscow as the Third Rome, the inheritor of the Christian imperial tradition that had passed from Rome to Constantinople, and now, they argued, to Moscow. The claim was grandiose and historically dubious, but it rested on a genuine chain of cultural transmission that the Varangian trade routes had made possible. The cultural legacy of the Viking Age extends beyond institutions and languages into the realm of imagination, the stories, the images, the archetypes that the Norse bequeathed to the world's collective mythology. And here the legacy is complicated by centuries of reinterpretation, romanticization, and outright fabrication that have created a popular image of the Vikings bearing only a passing resemblance to the historical reality. The horned helmet is the most persistent and most frustrating of these fabrications. No archaeological evidence supports the idea that Vikings wore horned or winged helmets in battle. The image derives from the 19th century, from Romantic-era painters, opera costume designers, and nationalist myth-makers who were constructing a vision of the Norse past to serve contemporary cultural and political purposes. The actual helmets recovered from Viking Age contexts are plain, conical, and functional, designed to protect the skull from sword blows rather than to provide dramatic silhouettes. The Yermunbu helmet, the only complete Viking Age helmet ever found, is a simple iron dome with a nose guard and chain mail curtain. It would not look out of place in any medieval arsenal. It would look absurd with horns attached. The 19th century reinvention of the Vikings was a phenomenon unto itself, and its effects persist powerfully to the present day. The Romantic movement's fascination with the wild, the primitive, and the authentically national found in the Norse past an irresistible subject. In Scandinavia, the rediscovery of the Icelandic sagas and the Eddas, the mythological and poetic texts that preserved the stories of the old gods, fueled a revival of interest in the pre-Christian past that became entangled with emerging nationalist movements. The Vikings became symbols of Scandinavian identity, courage, and independence, celebrated in art, literature, and public monuments that emphasized their martial prowess and their spirit of adventure while quietly setting aside the slavery, the violence, and the cultural complexity that the historical record reveals. In Germany, the Norse mythological tradition was appropriated even more aggressively. Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle, composed between 1848 and 1874, drew heavily on Norse mythological sources. The Volsunga Saga, the Poetic Edda, the Prose Edda, transforming them into a grand operatic narrative of gods, heroes, and cosmic destruction that became one of the most influential works of art in European history. Wagner's Valkyries, his Valhalla, his Siegfried and Brunhild, These are Norse figures filtered through German Romantic sensibility and set to music of overwhelming emotional power. Their influence on the popular imagination has been incalculable, but they are Wagner's creations, not historical reconstructions, and the distance between his Norsemen and the actual inhabitants of 9th century Scandinavia is vast. The appropriation of Norse symbolism by nationalist and supremacist movements in the 20th century added a darker dimension to the legacy. The Nazi regime drew heavily on Norse and Germanic mythological imagery. The SS lightning bolt runes, the cult of Teutonic warrior virtue, the idealization of a pre-Christian Nordic racial essence. This appropriation was historically illiterate. The actual Viking world was characterized by cultural mixing, linguistic adaptation, and intermarriage with every population the Norse encountered, from the Irish to the Slavs to the Byzantines. The Norse were among the most enthusiastic cultural borrowers in the medieval world, adopting and adapting the customs, technologies, and belief systems of every society they touched. The idea of a racially pure Norse civilization sealed off from foreign contamination is a fantasy that the archaeological and genetic evidence contradicts at every turn. The challenge for modern audiences is to disentangle the historical Vikings from the accumulated layers of myth, romance, and political appropriation that obscure them. The real Vikings were neither the noble savages of romantic imagination nor the cartoon barbarians of popular culture. They were complex, pragmatic, adaptable, and often brutal people who lived in a specific time and place and who responded to the opportunities and constraints of their environment with intelligence, creativity, and a willingness to use violence that was entirely typical of their era, if perhaps more effectively organized and more widely projected than most. The archaeological revolution of the 20th and 21st centuries has done more to reveal the real Vikings than any literary or historical source. The excavation of settlement sites, grave fields, urban centers, and shipwrecks across the entire Norse world has produced a material record of extraordinary richness, one that reveals dimensions of Viking life that the written sources composed almost exclusively by outsiders rarely capture. The role of women, for instance, emerges far more clearly from the archaeological record than from the sagas or the chronicles. The Oseberg ship burial, one of the most lavish Norse graves ever excavated, contained the remains of two women, not men, accompanied by an astonishing array of grave goods including a richly carved ceremonial wagon, textile working equipment, kitchen implements, and beds with carved animal head posts. The women's identities are unknown, but the scale of the burial indicates that they held positions of enormous social significance. Queens, priestesses, vulvas, practitioners of the Norse magical tradition known as Seder, or some combination of these roles. The Oseberg women challenge any narrative that reduces Norse society to a world of male warriors and their passive dependence. In 2017, a study published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology confirmed that a 10th century grave at Birka, in Sweden, long assumed to be that of a male warrior based on its weapons and military equipment, contained the skeleton of a woman. The grave included a sword, an axe, a spear, armor-piercing arrows, 2 horses, and a set of gaming pieces that suggested strategic military thinking. The genetic analysis was unambiguous. The occupant was biologically female. The discovery ignited a fierce debate about the existence of female warriors in Norse society, the shield maidens of saga tradition, and about the assumptions that archaeologists bring to the interpretation of grave goods. The debate remains unresolved, but the Birka warrior grave has permanently complicated any simple model of gender roles in the Viking Age. The material culture of everyday life, the combs, the shoes, the cooking pots, the children's toys, the animal bones that reveal patterns of diet and animal husbandry, paints a picture of a society that was far more domestic, far more commercially oriented, and far more connected to the wider world than the image of the blood-drinking berserker suggests. The Norse traded in goods from every corner of the known world. A single grave or hoard might contain Arabic silver, Byzantine silk, Frankish glassware, Irish brooches, and Baltic amber, alongside locally produced textiles, iron tools, and carved bone objects. These were people embedded in a global trading network of remarkable extent and sophistication. The genetic evidence accumulated through ancient DNA studies conducted in the 21st century has added yet another dimension to the picture. A landmark study published in Nature in 2020, by analyzing the genomes of more than 400 Viking Age individuals from across the Norse world, revealed patterns of genetic mixing that confirmed the archaeological and historical evidence of cultural fusion. Viking Age populations in the British Isles showed significant Scandinavian ancestry, as expected. But Scandinavian populations also showed genetic contributions from the British Isles, from the Baltic, and from southern Europe. The movement was not one-directional. The Norse did not simply impose themselves on the populations they encountered. They absorbed genetic material from every region they settled, creating populations of genuinely mixed heritage within a few generations of initial contact. The study also revealed that the category Viking was not synonymous with Scandinavian. Individuals buried with Viking-style grave goods and Norse cultural markers in the British Isles sometimes had little or no Scandinavian genetic ancestry, suggesting that the Viking identity was, to some degree, a cultural affiliation that could be adopted by people of diverse origins. A man or woman could become Norse through participation in Norse cultural practices, adopting the language, the dress, the burial customs, the social networks, regardless of their genetic background. This finding aligns with the historical evidence of a Viking world that was remarkably permeable, absorbing and integrating people from every population it encountered. The religious transformation of the Norse world is perhaps the most profound dimension of the Viking Age legacy, and its consequences extended far beyond Scandinavia itself. The conversion of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden to Christianity between the 10th and 12th centuries was not merely a change of worship. It was a civilizational reorientation that connected Scandinavia to the intellectual, institutional, and artistic traditions of Latin Christendom, and through it, to the classical heritage of Greece and Rome. With Christianity came literacy in the Latin alphabet, replacing the runic script that had served for brief inscriptions on stone and wood, but that was poorly suited to the recording of complex texts. With literacy came record-keeping, law codes, theological literature, and eventually the great flowering of Icelandic saga writing in the 13th century, a literary achievement that paradoxically depended on the Christian education system to preserve the memory of the pre-Christian world. The monks who transcribed the sagas, the Eddas, and the mythological poems were Christians recording a pagan past, and their work is marked by the tension between preservation and judgment, between admiration for the old heroes and the conviction that the old gods were demons. With Christianity came also the institutional infrastructure of the medieval church: bishops, dioceses, parishes, monasteries, canonical law, that provided Scandinavian kings with administrative tools far more powerful than anything the pagan chieftain system had offered. The church became an instrument of royal centralization, its hierarchy of authority mirroring and reinforcing the secular hierarchy of king, earl, and subject. The cathedral at Nidaros, built over the grave of St. Olaf, became not merely a place of worship, but a symbol of Norwegian national identity. The Archbishopric of Lund, established in 1104 as the metropolitan see for all of Scandinavia, gave the Scandinavian Church an organizational center independent of the German archbishoprics that had previously claimed jurisdiction. The conversion also transformed the Norse relationship with death and the afterlife in ways that had profound cultural consequences. The elaborate pagan burial practices, the ship burials, the grave goods, the sacrificial rituals that Ibn Fadlan had witnessed on the Volga gradually disappeared, replaced by the simpler Christian inhumation in consecrated ground. The belief in Valhalla, in the warrior's eternal feast among the slain, gave way to the Christian promise of heaven and the threat of hell. The old fatalism, the conviction that all things end, that even the gods must die at Ragnarok, was replaced by a linear theology of creation, fall, redemption, and final judgment. The psychological landscape of the Norse world was rebuilt from its foundations, and yet the old beliefs did not vanish completely. They went underground, persisting in folk customs, superstitions, seasonal festivals, and the oral traditions that the rural populations of Scandinavia maintained long after the official adoption of Christianity. The midwinter festival of Yule, with its feasting, its gift-giving, and its emphasis on light in the darkest season. He was absorbed into the celebration of Christmas with such thoroughness that the seam between pagan and Christian elements became invisible. Thursday, Thor's Day, preserved the thunder god's name in the English calendar, alongside Tuesday for Tyr, Wednesday for Woden, and Friday for Freya. The old gods survived not as objects of worship, but as linguistic fossils, embedded in the vocabulary of daily life and the rhythm of the week. The mythology itself, preserved in the Icelandic Eddas and transmitted through centuries of literary and artistic reinterpretation, became one of the foundational mythological systems of Western culture. The world tree Yggdrasil, the rainbow bridge Bifrost, the trickster god Loki, the twilight of the gods Ragnarok, with its vision of cosmic destruction followed by renewal. These images and narratives entered the European imagination through the Romantic revival of the 19th century and have proliferated in the 20th and 21st centuries through literature, film, television, and digital media to a degree that would have astonished the skalds who first composed them. J.R.R. Tolkien, the most influential fantasy writer of the 20th century, drew heavily and explicitly on Norse mythology and Old English literature. His dwarves, his dragons, his concept of a mythic northern world threatened by encroaching darkness, all derive from his deep scholarly engagement with the Norse and Anglo-Saxon literary tradition. The names of his dwarves in The Hobbit are taken directly from the Völuspá, the great Norse creation poem. His elvish languages owe structural debts to Finnish and Welsh, but the aesthetic sensibility, the melancholy, the sense of ancient things passing away, the dignity of a doomed stand against overwhelming evil, is profoundly Norse. The cultural influence continues to expand. The Marvel Cinematic Universe has brought Odin, Thor, and Loki to audiences of billions, transforming the gods of the Norse into modern mythological figures whose cultural reach now vastly exceeds anything they possessed in the medieval world. Video games, television series, and literary fiction set in the Viking Age have multiplied in recent decades, driven by a popular appetite for Norse history and mythology that shows no sign of diminishing. The appeal is not difficult to understand. The Norse world offers narrative ingredients of irresistible power, voyages into the unknown, battles against impossible odds, a cosmology of beauty and doom, and human characters who are neither wholly heroic nor wholly villainous, but complex, contradictory, and recognizably real. But the popular fascination carries risks, the same qualities that make the Vikings compelling: their courage, their independence, their willingness to risk everything can be abstracted from their historical context and used to serve agendas that the historical Norse would not have recognized. The Viking is symbol of white European supremacy. The Viking is avatar of masculine warrior virtue. The Viking is embodiment of a lost world of purity and strength. These are modern constructions built from selective readings of the evidence and serving contemporary ideological purposes. The historical record does not support them. The Norse world was multi-ethnic, multicultural, and globally connected. Its people mixed freely with every population they encountered. Its greatest cultural achievements, the sagas, the legal codes, the navigational knowledge, were products of collective effort, accumulated tradition, and cross-cultural exchange. To reduce this rich, messy human history to a symbol of racial or cultural purity is to betray it. The real legacy of the Vikings is at once more modest and more profound than any symbol can capture. It is the language that English speakers use every day without knowing its origins. It is the cities of Ireland and the legal traditions of England. It is the Cyrillic alphabet and the Orthodox cathedrals of Russia. It is the parliamentary tradition that traces one of its roots to the Althing at Thingvellir. It is the genetic inheritance carried by millions of people across Europe, the British Isles, and beyond. A molecular record of migration, settlement, and intermarriage that no written source could preserve with equal fidelity. And it is the stories, the sagas, the Eddas, the runic inscriptions, the chronicles of terrified monks and fascinated diplomats, the accumulated testimony of a civilization that valued the spoken word above almost everything, and that poured its deepest truths into narratives of extraordinary power and beauty. The men and women of the Viking Age did not write their own history for the most part. They lived it, and they trusted that others would remember. The remembering has continued for 1,000 years. It shows no sign of stopping. But before we close the book on the Viking Age, there remains one final dimension of the story to consider. Not what the Vikings left behind, but what their world looked like from the inside, in the texture of daily experience, in the rhythms of ordinary life that the chronicles of raids and conquests inevitably obscure. The kings and warriors have had their due. The farmers, the fishermen, the weavers, the shipwrights, the mothers who raised children in turf-walled longhouses while their husbands sailed toward uncertain horizon. Their story deserves telling too, and it is to them that we now turn. The daily life of a Norse farmer in the 9th or 10th century was governed by two forces that admitted no negotiation: the seasons and the light. In the northern latitudes where most Scandinavians lived, the difference between summer and winter was not merely a matter of temperature. It was a difference in the fundamental structure of existence. A midsummer day in western Norway might offer 20 hours of usable light, the sun barely dipping below the horizon before climbing again, the sky never fully darkening, the world suspended in a luminous twilight that blurred the boundary between day and night. A midwinter day in the same location might offer 4 or 5 hours of gray, low-angled light, the sun scraping along the southern horizon like a coin rolling along a table's edge before slipping below it again, surrendering the world to a darkness so complete and so prolonged that it became not an absence, but a presence, a thing with weight and texture that pressed against the walls of the longhouse and seeped through every crack. The longhouse was the center of everything. It was home, workshop, barn, armory, and social hall in a single structure, and its construction reflected centuries of refinement in the art of surviving northern winters. The typical longhouse was built on a framework of paired wooden posts set into the ground, supporting a roof of turf or thatch that curved gently from ridge to eave. The walls were thick, double layers of timber planking with earth or turf packed between them for insulation, or in some regions, walls built entirely of stacked turf blocks, their grassy surfaces growing together over time into a living skin that shed rain and held warmth. The floor was packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw, that was replaced periodically as it became soiled. The air inside was a permanent atmosphere of wood smoke, cooking smells, animal warmth, and the close presence of bodies. The central hearth was the heart of the household in a sense that was both practical and symbolic. It burned continuously, fed with wood or peat depending on what the local landscape offered, and its fire provided the only heat, the only cooking surface, and for much of the year, the only light. The smoke rose and found its way out through a hole in the roof ridge or through gaps in the gable ends, but the ventilation was never complete, and the interior of a longhouse was permanently hazy with smoke that blackened the rafters and stung the eyes. The health consequences, Reacher's respiratory disease, eye infections, chronic coughing, must have been significant, though they are invisible in the archaeological record and unmentioned in the written sources, accepted as simply part of what it meant to live indoors in a northern climate. Along the walls, raised platforms of earth or timber served as benches during the day and sleeping areas at night. The household slept in a communal arrangement that would strike modern sensibilities as startlingly intimate. Family members, servants, and slaves sharing the same long platforms, separated by hanging textiles or simply by the conventions of the household, their bodies providing mutual warmth through the bitter nights. Privacy in the modern sense did not exist. The interior of the longhouse was a single shared space in which every activity, eating, sleeping, working, arguing, lovemaking, childbirth, illness, death, took place within earshot and often within sight of every other member of the household. The household itself was a complex social unit that extended well beyond the nuclear family. A prosperous farmer's household might include his wife and children, his elderly parents, unmarried siblings or cousins, hired laborers, and enslaved workers, all living and working together under the authority of the household head. The total number might range from a dozen to 30 or more people, depending on the size and wealth of the farm. The relationships within this household were governed by a hierarchy that was understood by everyone and enforced through a combination of custom, authority, and the practical necessity of cooperation in an environment where survival depended on collective effort. The woman of the household, the husfreyja, the house lady, held a position of considerable authority within the domestic sphere. She carried the keys to the household's storage chests and storerooms, a responsibility that was both practical and symbolic, marking her as the manager of the household's resources. She directed the preparation of food, the production of textiles, the preservation of supplies for winter, and the daily organization of domestic labor. The Icelandic sagas depict women who are shrewd, articulate, and occasionally ruthless in the defense of their family's interests. Women who goaded reluctant husbands into action, who managed farms single-handedly during their husbands' long absences, who negotiated marriages and property settlements with the calculating precision of diplomats. These literary portraits are idealized and shaped by the conventions of saga narrative, but they reflect a social reality in which women's competence and authority within the household were recognized and valued. The legal status of women in Norse society was more nuanced than in many contemporary European cultures, though it fell far short of equality in any modern sense. Women could own property. They could inherit land and goods. They could initiate divorce proceedings under specific circumstances. They could testify in legal cases, but they could not participate in the political assemblies, the things that governed Norse communities. They could not serve as chieftains or hold formal political office. They were excluded from the raiding and trading expeditions that were the primary means of acquiring wealth and status in the wider world. Their sphere of influence was enormous within the household and severely circumscribed outside it. Textile production was the most labor-intensive and the most economically significant of the domestic arts. Every garment worn by every member of the household was produced on the premises, from the shearing of the sheep through the washing, carding, spinning, dyeing, and weaving of the wool to the cutting and sewing of the finished fabric. The warp-weighted loom, a large vertical frame from which weighted threads hung, the weaver working the weft through by hand, was a fixture of every longhouse, and the clacking of its weights and the rhythmic motion of the weaver's hands were among the constant sounds of domestic life. A single garment might represent weeks of labor. The production of enough cloth to dress a household and to provide the sails for a ship, each sail requiring hundreds of square feet of tightly woven wool, and often smeared with animal fat to make it water-resistant, was an undertaking of staggering scale. Modern reconstruction suggests that a single longship sail required the wool of approximately 200 sheep and up to 2 years of spinning and weaving by multiple workers. The longship was a technological marvel, but it was also a textile achievement of the first order, and the women who produced its sails were as essential to the Viking Age as the men who pulled its oars. The agricultural year began in spring, when the snow retreated and the ground thawed enough to accept a plow. The Norse plow was a simple implement, an aired, a pointed wooden blade that scratched a furrow in the soil without turning it over, drawn by a single ox or a pair of oxen across the small, irregular fields that the northern landscape permitted. The crops were limited by the short growing season and the cool, damp climate. Barley was the primary grain across most of Scandinavia, supplemented by oats and, in the more southerly regions of Denmark and southern Sweden, by rye and occasionally wheat. The grain was ground by hand in stone quern, paired circular stones turned by a wooden handle, and baked into flatbread or brewed into ale, the two forms in which most Norse people consumed their cereal calories. Livestock was as important as crops, and in many regions more so. Cattle provided milk, which was processed into butter, cheese, and skyr, a thick, tangy dairy product similar to yogurt that remains a staple of Icelandic cuisine to this day. Cattle also provided meat. Though slaughtering a cow represented the destruction of a significant capital asset and was reserved for the autumn, when the animals that could not be fed through the winter were killed and their meat preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. Sheep provided wool, milk, and meat, and were hardy enough to survive in conditions that would kill less robust livestock. Pigs were kept where the landscape supported them, particularly in the more forested regions of Denmark and Sweden, where they could forage for acorns and roots beneath the trees. Horses were valued not primarily as draft animals, but as riding animals and as status symbols. Horse fighting was a popular entertainment at assemblies and festivals, and the quality of a man's horse reflected his wealth and standing. The sea and its resources were woven into every aspect of coastal life. Fishing was not a seasonal activity, but a year-round occupation, pursued from small boats close to shore and from larger vessels on the open water. Cod, herring, and other species were caught in nets and on hooks, and the surplus was preserved through drying, hung on wooden racks in the cold, dry wind until it became stockfish, a hard, desiccated product that could be stored for months or even years without spoiling. Stockfish became one of Scandinavia's most important export commodities, feeding populations across medieval Europe and generating trade revenues that sustained coastal communities for centuries. Seals and whales supplemented the diet and provided raw materials: seal oil for lamps, seal skins for rope and clothing, all whalebone for tools and construction, whale blubber for food and fuel. The hunting of sea mammals required specialized boats, equipment, and knowledge, and the men who possessed these skills occupied a respected position in coastal communities. Whaling, in particular, was a dangerous enterprise, pursued in small boats against animals that could capsize or destroy a vessel with a single blow of their tails. And the successful killing of a whale was an event of communal significance, providing enough meat and blubber to feed a settlement for weeks. The rhythm of the agricultural and maritime year produced a calendar of labor that left little room for idleness. Spring was for plowing, sowing, and lambing. Summer was for haymaking and weighing, the single most critical agricultural activity of the year. Since the quantity and quality of the hay harvest determined how many animals could be kept through the winter, which in turn determined the household's food supply, its breeding stock, and its wealth. Haymaking was an all-hands effort, consuming weeks of labor in the brief window between the grass reaching its full height and the autumn rains that would rot it in the field. Every able-bodied member of the household, men, women, children, and slaves, worked from first light to last, cutting the grass with iron sickles or scythes, spreading it to dry, turning it, raking it into windrows, and finally stacking it in the barn or in outdoor haystacks protected from the weather. Autumn was for slaughtering, preserving meat, and preparing the household for winter. The animals that would not be kept, the old, the weak, the surplus, were killed, and their meat processed for storage. Blood sausage, smoked mutton, salted fish, dried meat, pickled vegetables, fermented dairy products. The Norse diet in winter was a catalog of preservation techniques, each one designed to extract the maximum nutritional value from the limited raw materials that the northern environment provided. Winter was the season of indoor work, repairing tools, processing raw materials, spinning and weaving, carving wood and bone, mending nets and sails, and maintaining the 1,000 small pieces of equipment on which a working farm depended. It was also the season of stories, the long, dark evenings, with the household gathered around the hearth and the wind howling outside the turf walls, were the natural setting for the oral traditions that preserved Norse culture from generation to generation. The sagas, the poems, the mythological narratives, the genealogies that connected living families to their ancestors, all were transmitted in this setting, spoken or chanted in the firelight by men and women whose memory served as the community's library. The skalds, the Norse poets, occupied a position of unique importance in this oral culture. A skilled skald was both artist and historian, composing verse in complex alliterative meters that imposed extraordinary demands on memory and linguistic virtuosity. The preferred form was drotkvet, a verse structure requiring 6 syllables per line, internal rhyme, alliteration linking specific stressed syllables, and the use of kennings, compressed metaphorical compounds that served as poetic synonyms. The sea was the whale road, or the swan's path. A ship was the horse of the waves. A sword was the wound snake, or the flame of battle. Gold was the fire of the river, or Sif's hair. Battle was the storm of spears, or the weather of weapons. These kennings were not merely decorative. They were structural. integral to the meter and meaning of the verse, and a skald's command of them, the ability to produce fresh, surprising combinations on demand, was the measure of his skill. The skald's social function was preservation through praise, a poem composed in honor of a king or chieftain, commemorating his victories, his generosity, and his lineage, served as a form of historical record that was simultaneously a political instrument. A king rewarded his skald with arm rings, land, and favor. In return, the skald ensured that the king's deeds would be remembered, not in a private document that could be lost or destroyed, but in a poem memorized by dozens of listeners and transmitted through the community, becoming part of the shared cultural memory that constituted Norse identity. The skald was, in effect, a living archive, and the verse he produced was designed to resist corruption. The intricate formal constraints of drotkvet made any alteration to the original wording immediately detectable, since changing a single word would destroy the meter, the rhyme, or the alliterative pattern. This built-in error correction mechanism gave skaldic poetry a reliability as historical evidence that prose traditions could not match, and modern historians treat contemporary skaldic verse as among the most trustworthy sources for the events they describe. The visual arts of the Viking Age were as sophisticated within their own conventions as the literary arts. Norse decorative style evolved through several distinct phases: the Oseberg style, the Bora style, the Jelling style, the Mammen style, the Ringerike style, and the Ernest style, each characterized by particular treatments of animal forms, interlacing patterns, and the relationship between figure and ground. The animal ornament that dominates Norse art is not representational in any straightforward sense. The creatures that writhe across the surfaces of brooches, ship prows, runestones, and church portals are not depictions of specific animals, but stylized, abstracted forms. Gripping beasts whose limbs twist back to grasp their own bodies, serpentine creatures whose tails become tendrils that interweave with neighboring forms, great cats and birds and dragons whose bodies dissolve into patterns of such complexity that the eye cannot easily trace where one figure ends and another begins. This art was not confined to prestigious objects. The decorative impulse penetrated every level of material culture. Bone combs were carved with geometric patterns. Leather sheaths were tooled with interlacing designs. Wooden tent poles, storage chests, and domestic utensils received the same attention to ornamental detail that was lavished on swords and ships. The Norse lived surrounded by decorated objects and the aesthetic sensibility that produced them, a love of complex pattern, of visual rhythm, or of the tension between order and chaos in interlocking forms, was as characteristic of the culture as its martial traditions or its seafaring skills. Metalwork reached particular heights of achievement. The Norse smiths who produced the silver brooches, the gold arm rings, the elaborately decorated sword hilts, and the delicate filigree ornaments found in graves and hoards across the Viking world were masters of techniques that required years of training and a deep understanding of the properties of different metals. Filigree, the art of forming fine wire into decorative patterns and soldering it to a metal surface, was practiced at a level of refinement that modern jewelers find challenging to replicate. Granulation, the technique of fusing tiny spheres of gold or silver to a surface to create textured patterns, required precise control of temperature and timing that could only be achieved through long experience. Niello, a black metallic alloy used to fill incised designs, creating dramatic contrast against a polished silver or gold background, added a graphic quality to metalwork that emphasized the clarity and precision of the underlying design. The sword was the supreme achievement of the Norse smith's art and also the most revealing artifact of Viking Age social structure. A high-quality Viking sword was not merely a weapon, it was a treasure, a family heirloom, a marker of status so potent that swords were given individual names, names that appear in the sagas as naturally as the names of the men who carried them. The blades were often pattern-welded, constructed by folding and twisting together rods of iron and steel with different carbon contents, then forging them into a single blade whose surface, when polished and etched, revealed swirling serpentine patterns in the metal. The technique produced a blade that was both hard and flexible, hard enough to hold a sharp edge, flexible enough to absorb the shock of combat without shattering. A pattern-welded blade represented dozens of hours of skilled labor at the forge and was correspondingly expensive. Only the wealthy could afford them. The ordinary farmer who served in the fjord or joined a raiding expedition was far more likely to carry a spear and a shield than a sword. The spear, in fact, was the common man's weapon, cheaper to produce, easier to master, and effective in the dense formations that characterized Norse infantry combat. The shield wall, a line of warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, their round wooden shields overlapping to create a continuous barrier of lime or birch wood, was the fundamental tactical formation of Viking Age warfare on land. The spear was thrust over or around the shield, probing for gaps in the opposing wall, while the shield itself served as both defensive barrier and offensive weapon used to push, to hook an opponent's shield aside, and to create the openings through which a blade could reach flesh. The axe, particularly the broad-bladed Danish axe, wielded two-handed with devastating effect, was the other characteristic Norse weapon capable of splitting a shield, a helmet, or a man with a single blow. Combat in the Viking Age was intimate, more physical, and appallingly brutal. The distances were measured in feet, not yards. The weapons were designed for close work, for cutting, thrusting, and crushing at a range where you could smell your opponent's breath and see the expression in his eyes. The shield wall was a collective effort, each man's survival depending on the man beside him holding his position and maintaining the integrity of the line. A man who broke and ran did not merely endanger himself, he opened a gap through which the enemy could pour, collapsing the entire formation. The social pressure against cowardice was accordingly immense, reinforced by a shame culture that regarded flight from battle as a stain that could follow a man and his family for generations. The berserkers, warriors who fought in a state of apparent frenzy, howling, biting their shields, these seemingly impervious to pain, occupy a prominent place in the popular imagination of the Viking Age, but their historical reality is difficult to assess. The sagas describe them. The term itself has entered the English language, but whether berserkers represented a genuine martial practice, warriors who induced altered states through drugs, psychological techniques, or religious ritual, or whether they were a literary convention, an idealized figure used by saga authors to dramatize the extremes of battlefield courage, remains uncertain. Some scholars have proposed that the berserker frenzy was induced by the consumption of Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric mushroom, whose psychoactive properties were known in northern cultures. Others have suggested that the behavior was a form of combat stress response, a dissociative state triggered by the extreme psychological pressure of close quarters fighting. The honest answer is that we do not know. The berserker exists at the intersection of history and mythology, and the boundary between the two cannot be drawn with confidence. What can be said with confidence is that violence in the Norse world was not confined to the battlefield. It was embedded in the social fabric at every level. The feud, the obligation of a man's kin to avenge injury or insult through retaliatory violence, was a central mechanism of social regulation in a world without police, prisons, or standing armies. The Icelandic sagas are in large part accounts of feuds, cycles of insult, injury, legal maneuvering, and killing that could persist across generations, drawing in ever wider circles of kinship and alliance until entire communities were consumed. The law existed to contain and channel this violence, not to eliminate it. Compensation, vergild, man price, could be paid to settle a killing, converting a blood debt into an economic transaction. Arbitration at the Thing Assembly could impose terms on feuding parties. Outlawry could remove a persistent troublemaker from the community. But the underlying assumption was that violence was a legitimate response to certain provocations, and that a man who failed to avenge an injury to himself or his kin was not a peacemaker, but a coward. This culture of honor violence coexisted with a sophistication of legal thought that seems, to modern eyes, paradoxical. The Norse legal codes, when they were eventually written down, reveal a society that thought carefully and systematically about rights, obligations, property, kinship, and the procedures by which disputes should be resolved. The procedures were elaborate. Cases required specific forms of testimony, specific numbers of witnesses, specific oaths sworn in specific ways. The legal system was, within its own framework, rational, procedural, and concerned with fairness, but it operated alongside and was sometimes overridden by a code of personal honor that demanded violence as the appropriate response to dishonor. The tension between law and honor, between the collective interest in peace and the individual obligation to avenge, runs through the sagas like a structural beam, holding up the narrative while simultaneously threatening to bring the whole edifice crashing down. These children in this world grew up fast. There was no prolonged childhood in the modern sense, no period of protected development separated from the demands of adult life. Children were expected to contribute to the household's labor from an early age, tending livestock, collecting fuel, helping with food preparation, learning the skills they would need as adults through observation and participation, rather than through formal instruction. Boys learned to handle weapons, to sail, to work with tools. Girls learned textile production, food preservation, and household management. By the age of 12 or 13, a boy might join a raiding or trading expedition. By the same age, a girl might be betrothed. Her marriage negotiated by her father as part of a family alliance strategy in which her own preferences were a secondary consideration at best. The games that children played for and that adults played with equal enthusiasm reflected the culture's values with startling directness. Board games, particularly Hnefatafl, a strategic game in which a defending king attempts to escape a surrounding force of attackers, were played at every level of society, and gaming pieces are among the most common artifacts found in Norse graves. The game's asymmetric structure, one side attacking, the other defending and escaping, mirrored the strategic realities of a world in which raiding and defense were constant preoccupations. Wrestling, swimming, horse fighting, archery contests, and ball games of various kinds provided physical training under the guise of entertainment. The sagas mention ice skating on bone skates, flattened animal bones strapped to the feet, and skiing on primitive wooden skis, both practical transportation methods that doubled as competitive sports. The diet of the ordinary Norse household was monotonous by modern standards, but nutritionally adequate for the demands of a life of heavy physical labor. Dairy products provided the bulk of calories for much of the year. Milk, butter, cheese, and skyr consumed in quantities that would astonish modern nutritionists. Meat was available seasonally, concentrated in the autumn slaughter, and preserved for winter consumption. Fish, both fresh and dried, supplemented the diet year-round in coastal and riverine communities. Bread, and when grain was available, was baked as flatbread on a griddle stone over the hearth fire, thin, dense, and unleavened, quite different from the risen loaves of southern Europe. Vegetables were limited: onions, garlic, cabbages, peas, and various wild plants gathered from the surrounding landscape. Fruit was scarce. Wild berries in season, and in the more southerly regions, occasional apples. Honey was the only sweetener, and its scarcity made it a luxury item. Ale was the daily drink, brewed from barley and flavored with whatever local herbs or additives were available. Before the widespread adoption of hops, Norse ale was flavored with a mixture called grut, which might include yarrow, sweet gale, juniper berries, and other plants whose precise combination varied by region and by brewer. Mead, honey wine, or fermented from diluted honey, was the prestige drink. Reserved for feasts and special occasions, its sweetness and its association with the gods making it the appropriate beverage for ritual and celebration. The feasts themselves were events of enormous social importance, occasions for the display of generosity that was a chieftain's primary obligation to his followers. a chieftain who feasted his men lavishly, who provided abundant food, copious ale, and gifts of silver, weapons, or clothing, was a chieftain worth following. One who failed in generosity was a chieftain whose hall would soon stand empty. The feasting hall at its best was a space of genuine warmth and human connection, a refuge from the cold and the dark, filled with the smell of roasting meat and the sound of skaldic verse and laughter and the crackle of the central fire. The modern imagination, shaped by the violence and drama of the sagas, tends to emphasize the martial and the tragic dimensions of Norse life. But the hall was also a place of fellowship, of storytelling, of the simple pleasure of warmth and food, and the company of people you knew. The long winters forced an intimacy that could breed conflict, but that also created bonds of extraordinary depth. The men who sailed together, fought together, and feasted together in the same hall developed loyalties that the sagas describe in language as intense as any love poetry. Loyalties that could outlast betrayal, exile, and even death. It was this texture of ordinary life, the daily labor, the seasonal rhythms, the domestic arts, the communal bonds forged through shared hardship and shared pleasure, that gave the Viking Age its human foundation. The raids, the conquests, the voyages of exploration, these were the extraordinary events that drew the attention of chroniclers and that dominate the historical record. But they were undertaken by people whose lives, for the most part, were consumed by the same concerns that have consumed human beings in every era: feeding their families, raising their children, maintaining their homes, honoring their obligations, and finding meaning in a world that offered beauty and brutality in roughly equal measure. The Norse did not think of themselves as participants in a Viking Age. They did not know that the events they were living through would one day be studied, debated, romanticized, and distorted by people living in circumstances beyond their ability to imagine. They knew the fjord and the farm, the ship and the sea, the hall and the hearth. They knew the weight of an oar in their hands and the taste of salt spray on their lips. They knew the sound of a saga spoken in firelight and the silence of a winter night so deep that the stars seemed to crackle in the frozen air. They lived, as all people live, in the immediate present, concerned with the immediate future, connected to the immediate past through the memories of their parents and grandparents, the vast sweep of their collective achievement, the exploration, the state building, the cultural transformation was visible only from a distance they could never occupy. To each individual, life was particular, local, and finite. A farm to work, a family to feed, a reputation to build or defend, a death to face when it came, with whatever courage could be summoned. The world they inhabited was harsh, and they knew it was temporary. The mythology told them so. Ragnarok was coming, the great destruction that would consume gods and men alike, the wolf swallowing the sun, the serpent rising from the sea, the final battle on the plain of Vigrid where everything would end. But the mythology also told them that after Ragnarok, the world would be renewed. The earth would rise again from the sea, green and fertile. 2 human survivors would emerge from hiding to repopulate the world. A new sun would shine. The cycle would begin again. It was a vision of the universe that was neither wholly hopeful nor wholly despairing, but that held both in suspension. The certainty of destruction balanced against the promise of renewal, the darkness of winter balanced against the return of the light. It was perhaps the only cosmology that could have been produced by people who lived at the edge of the habitable world, where the seasons enacted the drama of death and resurrection every year, where the darkness always returned but so did the sun, where the ice always came but always eventually retreated. That cosmology shaped everything. It shaped the stories they told, the gods they worshipped, the choices they made in moments of crisis, and the way they understood their own place in the sweep of time. Then, when the old gods were finally replaced by the new one, when the cross supplanted the hammer and the church replaced the sacred grove, the underlying sensibility persisted, absorbed into the Christianity that the Norse adopted but never entirely surrendered to. The melancholy, the fatalism, the stubborn insistence on dignity in the face of inevitable defeat. These qualities survived the conversion and passed into the cultural DNA of the Scandinavian world, where they can still be detected 1,000 years later, in the literature, the art, and the temperament of peoples whose ancestors first gave them voice in the firelight of a turf-walled hall. The ordinary men and women of the Viking Age left no chronicles, composed no sagas, carved no runestones. They are known to us only through the things they made and left behind, the bones of the animals they raised, the seeds of the crops they planted, the tools they forged, the textiles they wove, the foundations of the houses they built. These silent traces, read with patience and care, tell a story as rich and as complex as any saga. It is the story of human beings making a life at the far edge of possibility, wresting sustenance and meaning from a landscape that offered little of either freely and building through generations of accumulated skill and collective memory, a civilization that would reach out and touch every corner of the known world before finally, gradually, folding back into the land from which it had come. The longships are gone, the great halls have fallen. The old gods sleep in the pages of manuscripts written by the monks of a religion they would not have recognized. But the farms are still there. In Iceland, in Norway, in the Faroe Islands, some of them worked continuously for 1,000 years, the same fields plowed by the descendants of the men and women who first cleared them. The sheep still graze the same hillsides. The wind still carries the same salt smell from the same gray sea. And the stories are still told, in languages that have changed less than almost any others in Europe, by people who carry in their blood and in their memory the inheritance of an age that refuses, despite every expectation, to be forgotten. The inheritance is not always comfortable. And to reckon honestly with the Viking Age is to confront a past that resists the simplifications that human memory prefers. The clean division into heroes and villains, the reassuring arc from darkness to light, the notion that history moves in one direction and that the direction is upward. The Viking Age offers no such comfort. It offers instead a mirror, and what it reflects is not a foreign world but a recognizable one, a world in which ambition and cruelty were inseparable, in which the same hands that built could destroy, in which the price of extraordinary achievement was paid almost always by those who had no say in the transaction. The enslaved woman on the Volga, whose death Ibn Fadlan recorded with such horrified precision, had no saga. The monks of Lindisfarne, whose life's work was scattered across the rocks in a single afternoon, left no monument to their loss except Alcuin's letter and the silence where their voices had been. The Irish villagers who were dragged from their homes and sold in the Dublin slave market, and their names are not preserved in any chronicle, their faces are not carved on any runestone, their descendants, if they survived, were absorbed into populations that forgot their origins within a generation. The Slavic communities along the Volga and the Dnieper, whose people were harvested like a natural resource to feed the Scandinavian appetite for silver, they appear in the sources only as commodities, counted and traded and consumed by an economic system that measured human beings in dirhams. To celebrate the Vikings without acknowledging these people is to tell half a story and call it whole. To condemn the Vikings without acknowledging their achievements is to commit the same error in the opposite direction. The honest reckoning requires holding both truths simultaneously, the longship and the slave chain, the saga and the silence, the art and the axe. It requires recognizing that the capacity for creation and the capacity for destruction are not opposing forces in human nature, but aspects of the same force directed by circumstance, opportunity, and the moral frameworks that a culture provides to channel the energies of its people. The Norse moral framework was not the modern one. It valued loyalty over compassion, fame over mercy, action over reflection. It was a framework shaped by scarcity, by danger, by the perpetual proximity of death in a landscape where a bad harvest, a winter storm, or a hostile neighbor could end a family's existence in a single season. The men and women who lived within that framework were not morally inferior to their modern descendants. They were differently situated, facing different pressures, operating within different constraints, and making decisions that were rational and coherent within their own system of values, even when those decisions produced outcomes that the modern conscience cannot accept. This is not moral relativism. It is historical empathy. The disciplined effort to understand the past on its own terms before judging it by ours. The slave trade was an atrocity. The raids on monasteries were acts of violence against unarmed people. The conquest of foreign lands was an imposition of power on populations who had not consented to it. These things are true, and no amount of contextualizing can make them otherwise. But they are also true of virtually every powerful civilization in the medieval world. The Carolingian Franks, the Byzantine Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms themselves, all participated in slavery, all waged wars of conquest, all imposed their authority on unwilling populations through violence. The Norse were not unique in their capacity for cruelty. They were unique in their mobility, their reach, and the particular combination of technological innovation and cultural daring that allowed a relatively small population on the northern fringe of Europe to project its influence across an area stretching from Newfoundland to Baghdad. In that projection, its scale, its speed, its transformative effect on every society it touched is what makes the Viking Age historically significant beyond the boundaries of Scandinavia. The Norse did not merely raid, trade, and settle. They accelerated the pace of cultural exchange across an entire hemisphere. They connected societies that had never been in contact. They carried goods, ideas, technologies, diseases, and genetic material across distances that no previous Northern European population had traversed. The Arabic silver that ended up in a Gotland hoard had been minted in Central Asia, carried by camel to a river port, traded through multiple intermediaries, and finally exchanged for furs or slaves by a Swedish merchant standing on the banks of the Volga. The Irish metalwork techniques that appear in Scandinavian brooches of the 10th century had traveled from monastic workshops to Norse raiders to Scandinavian smiths, who adapted and transformed them into something new. The Byzantine silk that clothed a Norwegian chieftain's funeral had been woven on looms 1,000 miles to the southeast, and carried north through a chain of commercial relationships that spanned the entire length of the European continent. The Viking Age was, in this sense, an early episode of globalization. Not the first, and not the most consequential, but one that reshaped the human geography of the North Atlantic, the Baltic, and the river systems of Eastern Europe in ways that are still visible today. The cities the Norse founded are still standing. The trade routes they established evolved into the commercial networks that would sustain medieval and early modern European commerce. The political entities they created, the kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the Duchy of Normandy, the Kievan Rus state, became the foundations of modern nations. The genetic legacy they left behind is carried by millions of people who have no knowledge of its origin. And the stories. Always, finally, the stories. The Icelandic manuscripts that preserve the sagas, the Eddas, and the skaldic poetry of the Viking Age survived the centuries by the thinnest of margins. Iceland's climate, damp, cold, and corrosive to organic materials, was hostile to the preservation of vellum and parchment. Fires, both accidental and deliberate, destroyed unknown quantities of manuscript material over the centuries. The Reformation, which swept Iceland in the 16th century, brought with it a wave of iconoclasm that valued the doctrinal purity of the new faith over the literary treasures of the old. Manuscripts were cut up for shoe leather, used as patches for clothing, or simply discarded as pagan relics unworthy of preservation. What survived did so largely through the efforts of a single 17th century Icelandic scholar. Árni Magnússon, born in 1663, spent decades traveling across Iceland, visiting farms and churches, purchasing or borrowing every manuscript he could find, and assembling a collection that would become the most important archive of Old Norse literature in existence. He brought many of these manuscripts to Copenhagen, where he held an academic appointment, and housed them in a university collection that bore his name. In 1728, a catastrophic fire swept through Copenhagen, destroying a third of the city. The fire reached the university district, and Magnusson's collection was in its path. He and his assistants managed to save many of the manuscripts, carrying them through the streets in armloads while the buildings burned around them, but an unknown number were lost. Magnusson himself was broken by the disaster. He spent the remaining 2 years of his life attempting to catalog what had been destroyed, and died in 1730 without completing the task. The manuscripts that survived the Copenhagen fire became the foundation of modern Old Norse scholarship. They include the sole surviving copy of the Prose Edda, Snorri Sturluson's 13th century masterwork of Norse mythology and poetic theory. They include the Codex Regius, the manuscript containing the Poetic Edda, the collection of mythological and heroic poems that preserves the oldest and most authentic versions of the Norse creation myth, the death of Balder, the wisdom of Odin, and the prophecy of Ragnarok. They include dozens of sagas, genealogies, legal texts, and historical works that together constitute the most extensive body of medieval vernacular literature produced anywhere in Europe. These texts are not merely Icelandic treasures. They are human treasures. Records of a way of understanding the world that was shared, in its essentials, by millions of people across the Norse world for centuries before it was displaced by Christianity and forgotten by all but the Icelanders who committed it to writing. The Codex Regius, that single battered manuscript, is the primary surviving record of an entire mythological system, a system as rich, as complex, and as psychologically penetrating as the Greek and Roman mythologies that have been studied and celebrated for 2 millennia. Without Snorri Sturluson, without the anonymous poets of the Poetic Edda, without the saga authors whose names are mostly lost, the Norse world would be known to us only through the frightened accounts of its victims and the mute evidence of archaeology. We would have the ship burials but not the myths. We would have the silver hoards but not the poems. We would have the bones of the dead but not the stories they told about why dying mattered. The return of the manuscripts to Iceland became a cause of deep national significance in the 20th century. The Icelandic government negotiated for decades with Denmark for the repatriation of the Árni Magnusson collection, arguing that the manuscripts were integral to Icelandic national identity and should reside in the country where they had been created. On April 21st, 1971, 2 of the most important manuscripts, the Codex Regius and Fleti Jarbok, a massive compilation of Norse royal sagas, were transported by Danish naval vessel to Reykjavik. Thousands of Icelanders lined the harbor to watch the manuscripts come ashore. The crowd was silent at first, then erupted in emotion as the wooden crates were carried from the ship. Grown men wept. It was for Iceland a moment of cultural homecoming as profound as any political independence, the return of the nation's memory to the nation's soil. The manuscripts continue to come home. The transfer of the collection, proceeding in stages, was not fully completed until 1997. The Árni Magnusson Institute in Reykjavik now houses the world's most important collection of Old Norse manuscripts, preserved in climate-controlled vaults and studied by scholars from around the world. The survival of these texts, against fire, damp, neglect, and the accumulated indifference of centuries, is one of the most improbable triumphs of cultural preservation in human history. A civilization that valued the spoken word above the written one was saved for posterity by the written word it had belatedly adopted. Are preserved through a chain of individual dedication that stretches from the anonymous Icelandic monk who first put stylus to vellum to the Danish sailor who carried the crates to the Reykjavik dockside in 1971. There is a rune stone in the churchyard at Gripsholm in the Swedish province of Södermanland that speaks across 1,000 years with a voice of quiet devastation. It was raised, according to its inscription, by a woman named Tola in memory of her son Harold, brother of Ingvar. The inscription reads, in the standard formula of Norse memorial stones, that they fared like men far after gold, and in the east gave the eagle food. They died southward in Serkland. Serkland, the land of the Saracens, the Islamic world. Ingvar was the leader of a Swedish expedition that traveled east through the river systems of Russia. He reached the Caspian Sea and ventured into the territories of the Islamic Caliphate sometime around 1040. The expedition ended in disaster. The entire force was apparently destroyed, by disease, by battle, or by some combination of the two. More than 20 runestones across Sweden commemorate men who died on Ingvar's expedition, each one raised by a grieving family, each one repeating the same sparse facts in the same formulaic language. They traveled far. They died in the east. Remember them. The Gripsholm stone is famous because of its final phrase, and in the east gave the eagle food. It is a kenning. To give the eagle food is to create corpses on a battlefield, to kill or to die in killing, leaving bodies for the scavenging birds. It is a poetic euphemism of extraordinary compression, transforming the horror of death in a foreign land into an image of grim beauty. Tola, the mother who ordered the stone carved, chose to remember her son not with grief but with the language of honor. The language that said he had died as a man should die, far from home, in the midst of action, leaving his mark on the world, even as the world consumed him. The stone stands in the churchyard still, its runes as legible as the day they were carved. The serpentine dragon that frames the inscription still coiling around the text in the characteristic earnest style of the mid-11th century. The church beside it has been rebuilt many times. The village around it has changed beyond recognition. The political and religious world that produced the stone has been dead for a millennium. But Tola's voice endures, in as clear and as specific as the day she spoke the words to the carver, telling him what to write about her son. This is what the Viking Age was, not the horned helmets, not the berserker rage, not the romantic vision of free-spirited warriors sailing into the sunset. It was Tola, standing in a Swedish churchyard, raising a stone for a son who would never come home. It was the monk at Lindisfarne, watching the painted pages of his life's work dissolve in the rain. It was the unnamed slave girl on the Volga, walking toward the ship where she would die. It was Eric the Red, standing on a green slope in Greenland, inventing a name to lure settlers to a land he wanted to rule. It was Alfred, crouching in a marsh, planning the salvation of a kingdom. It was Leif Erikson beaching his ship on a shore that his world had no name for. And it was the woman buried in the Oseberg ship, her identity lost, her grave goods speaking of a power and a status that the written sources never acknowledge. It was the skald in the firelight, building a poem word by word, kenning by kenning, knowing that the verse would outlast the hall, the king, and the world that produced them both. It was human beings doing what human beings have always done, reaching beyond the boundaries of the Norse, taking what they could, building what they could, destroying what stood in their way, loving fiercely, grieving deeply, and telling stories to hold back the dark. The dark held off for a remarkably long time. The Viking Age, measured by its conventional dates of 793 to 1066, lasted 273 years, roughly the same span that separates the American Revolution from the present day. In that time, the Norse touched 4 continents. They established settlements from Newfoundland to the Caspian, from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. They built kingdoms that endured for centuries and trade networks that reshaped the economies of half the world. They produced a body of literature that stands among the great achievements of the human imagination. They did all of this without a single university, without a single library, without a written language of their own until the very end of the period, and with a total population that probably never exceeded 2 million people. 2 million. the population of a modern city spread across the vast, harsh, beautiful landscape of Scandinavia, and from that thin human base they reshaped the world. How? The question has no single answer, but every attempt at an answer returns eventually to the same elements: the ships, the seamanship, the social structure that rewarded risk and punished passivity, the geography that made the sea a road rather than a wall, the mythology that valued fame above longevity and action above safety, the adaptability that allowed Norse settlers to adopt the language, the religion, and the customs of every society they entered while retaining an identity coherent enough to persist across generations, and perhaps most of all, the willingness, the sheer, relentless willingness to go somewhere, anywhere, out of the fjord, across the sea, up the river, over the mountain, past the horizon. The runic inscriptions return to this theme with obsessive frequency. He traveled widely. He went east. He went west. He fared far. And the highest praise the Norse could offer a man was not that he was strong, not that he was wise, not that he was rich, but that he had gone, that he had left the known world and ventured into the unknown and come back or not come back, but either way had refused to stay in one place and accept the boundaries that geography and circumstance had drawn around his life. This restlessness was the engine of the Viking Age, and it was also its limit. The Norse expanded across the known world with astonishing speed, but they could not sustain what they had built. The Greenland colonies failed. The Vinland settlement was abandoned. The Rus elite was absorbed into the Slavic population it had once ruled. The Danelaw was reconquered by English kings. The Norse communities in Ireland were subdued by the very dynasties they had helped to create. Normandy became French. The Varangian Guard became a memory. One by one, the far-flung outposts of the Norse world were reclaimed by the civilizations they had disrupted, and the Scandinavian heartland was left to evolve quietly into the Christian kingdoms of the High Middle Ages. The pattern is not unique to the Norse. Every great expansion in human history, the Polynesian settlement of the Pacific, the Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries, the Mongol Empire of the 13th, follows a similar arc. A relatively small population, driven by some combination of demographic pressure, technological advantage, and cultural energy, expands rapidly across a vast area, transforming every society it touches. Then the expansion slows, the energy dissipates, the peripheral settlements are absorbed or abandoned, and the heartland consolidates into something more stable and less dynamic than what had come before. The Vikings followed this pattern with textbook precision. Their age of expansion was brief, brilliant, and ultimately unsustainable. What it left behind was not an empire, but a legacy, scattered, fragmented, embedded in the foundations of a dozen different civilizations, invisible to those who do not know where to look. But it is there, in every English sentence that uses the word they, in every ship that enters Dublin Harbor, in every Orthodox church whose dome traces its architectural lineage to Byzantine models transmitted through Varangian channels, in every Icelandic farm that has been worked continuously for 1,000 years. In every strand of DNA that carries the molecular signature of a Scandinavian ancestor who sailed across a sea, married into a foreign community, and raised children who spoke a different language and worshipped a different god, but who carried within them, unknowing, the biological inheritance of the fjords. There is a moment near the end of the Voluspa, the prophecy of the seeress, the greatest of the Norse mythological poems, that captures something essential about the civilization that produced it. The poem has described the creation of the world, the rise of the gods, the golden age of Asgard, and the slow accumulation of treachery and violence that leads inexorably to Ragnarok. The seeress has watched the gods fall, Odin swallowed by the wolf, Thor killed by the serpent's venom, the sun devoured, the stars extinguished, the earth sinking into the sea. Everything is gone. The long story that began with fire and ice ends in fire and darkness, and then the poem turns, the earth rises again from the sea, green and fair, waterfalls cascade down the mountains, an eagle soars above them, hunting fish in the streams. The surviving gods gather on the plains of Ida, where Asgard once stood, and they find in the grass the golden playing pieces that the gods had used in the beginning, before the corruption set in and the tokens of the innocent age before greed and violence entered the world. The fields bear fruit without being sown. All sorrows are healed. It is not a Christian vision of paradise, though Christians would later read it that way. It is something older and stranger, a vision of cyclical renewal, of destruction that is not final but generative, of a world that must die in order to be reborn. The Norse did not believe in progress. They did not believe that the future would be better than the past. They believed that the past had been better, that the golden age was behind them, that the world was running down, that Ragnarok was approaching and could not be prevented. But they also believed that after the end there would be a new beginning, that the pieces would be found in the grass, that the green earth would rise from the black water, that it was worth building and creating and striving and going, even in a world destined for destruction, because the destruction was not the end of the story. The story went on. This is the gift the Norse left the world. Not the ships, not the silver, not the conquered territories or the founded cities. Those were products of a specific historical moment, bound to the circumstances that produced them. The gift was something more durable, a way of facing the darkness without despair, of acknowledging the inevitability of loss without surrendering the will to act. The gift was a sensibility, a posture toward existence that said, the world is beautiful and the world is doomed, and therefore every beautiful thing matters more, not less, because it will not last. The farmer tending his field in the brief northern summer, knowing that winter will come and the darkness will return, does not stop farming. The shipwright shaping a hull from oak, knowing that the sea will eventually claim it, does not stop building. The skald composing a verse in the firelight, I knowing that the hall will fall and the hearth will go cold and the language itself will change beyond recognition, does not stop speaking. The mother raising a stone for her dead son, knowing that the stone will stand in a churchyard long after her own name is forgotten, does not stop remembering. They fared like men far after gold, and in the east gave the eagle food. Remember them. The fire in the longhouse is burned down to embers, the saga is told. Outside, the North Atlantic wind moves across a landscape that has changed less than almost any other on Earth. The same gray sea, the same green slopes, the same vast sky. Somewhere beneath that sky, beneath centuries of accumulated soil and silence, the keel of a longship rests in the earth where it was buried. Its oak ribs still holding the shape of the vessel that once carried men beyond the edge of the known world. The wood is dark now, compressed by the weight of the years, but the grain is still visible. The same grain that the shipwright followed with his axe 1,000 years ago, splitting the plank along the natural lines of the tree, trusting the wood to tell him where to cut. The grain runs true. It has always run true. And the stories, like the grain, follow lines laid down long ago, lines of human courage and human cruelty, of ambition and loss, of the endless reach towards something just beyond the horizon. The Vikings reached further than anyone had the right to expect. They touched the edges of the world and left their mark on every shore they found. And then the sea closed over them as the sea closes over everything. And the world moved on. But the stones remain, and the stories remain. And on certain nights when the northern lights unfurl across the Arctic sky in curtains of green and violet fire, and the wind carries the smell of salt and cold stone and ancient earth, it is possible to stand on the same ground where they stood, to look out across the same dark water where they sailed, and to feel, just for a moment, in the silence between the waves, the presence of the world they made, and the world that made them still resonating, still alive, still refusing to be forgotten. The longships are gone. The gods are sleeping. The age has passed, but the sea road is still open, and the stories have not ended. They have only changed their form, passing from the lips of skalds to the pages of manuscripts to the screens and speakers of a world the Norse could never have imagined, carrying across the centuries the same ancient truth that Tola carved into stone for her son, that the seeress sang at the dawn of creation, that every man and woman who ever stood at the prow of a ship and watched an unknown shore materialize out of the mist has known in their bones without needing to be told. The world is vast, the darkness is real, and we go anyway.